And we are recording now.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. I don't know if you want to start or if you want me to jump in.
No, go ahead, please.
Okay. It's nice to see all of you. I know most of you. I've met all of you now. My name is Jessica Smith. I'm with Shipman and Goodwin. And this is one of my favorite things to do, these board trainings. I have kind of a teaching style, so I like to make this interactive. I might ask you questions. I have a lot of scenarios in here, but I also have some informational slides, which I'll try not to read, but rather ask for your input and ask to see what you know. Also, part of the purpose of this is to facilitate a conversation among all of you with your superintendent and your assistant superintendent about how you want to function as a board interacting with your administration. There are different ways to do that. There are best practices, but I think that this is a good opportunity for you guys to have that conversation. Before we begin, how much time do I have?
I think
9
it's
to
12.
12, 3 hours.
We've got to tell
Amazing.
noon.
That's great. So we'll probably be able to get through all of my scenarios. Sometimes I skip around, but I want to just start by asking you all, this is the agenda that I'm going to be covering today. I gave you all folders with some goodies in them. I see you have a printed version of the slides. I also printed a notes version in case you want to take notes. On the right side of the folder, there is an email memo about board communications by email. It's a cautionary memo. We'll cover it, but it's just sets forth the legal framework around meetings, illegal meetings by email, which is an important piece of what we're going to be talking about. I also printed out some policies that Melissa told me have come up in recent months, so you have them there in case you need them. And then I printed out the Freedom of Information Commission's primer on remote meetings, because there are a lot of new rules if you meet remotely or if you meet in hybrid fashion, in part remotely and in part in person. You have to follow these specific rules, so there they are in case you need them. I want to start by talking about board roles and responsibilities. We'll also talk about Lisa's role, the role of the superintendent. We'll cover the Freedom of Information Act, board meeting, and such as board meeting essentials, executive session, conducting a meeting. We'll talk a little bit about Robert's rules in case you guys need a refresher on that. And we'll end by talking about communications and information sharing, because that's something that comes up a lot with respect to how the board is going to interact with the superintendent and the administrative staff. So I want to start by asking you all, board members, what you think your role is as a board. And this is where my teaching style comes in, because I can certainly lecture to you, but I'm interested to hear what you all think your job is as a Board of Education. So what's one thing that you are primarily responsible for?
I'll throw out a word, but it's a big word. So I'm guessing like oversight would be one category you could put those under.
Yeah, oversight. So how do you mean oversight? Oversight of what or whom?
It's a great question. This broadly, like some degree of backstop of like maybe decision making or allocation of resources or something like that. But honestly, I'm not as certain as I should be.
Yeah, that's
partly why I'm here as the new board member.
Yeah, it's a great word, because you're absolutely right. You oversee your one employee. Does anybody know who your one employee is as a Board of Education? Lisa, right? So you oversee Lisa. You're responsible for hiring her. You're responsible for overseeing her. You're responsible for evaluating her. But she is your chief executive officer. So much like any other board, not even in the public sector, you are responsible for overseeing your CEO. So you mentioned also backstopping and decision making. Does anybody know what the board's role is with respect to decision making? What do you decide?
Budget.
Yep, the budget, exactly. That's a big one. What else? How do you govern? How do you decide what rules are in place for your school district? Do you make the rules? Do you enforce them?
We pass policies.
Exactly. Yes. You decide. Your policies are your laws, in effect. as a Board of Education. In a way, you are the legislature of your school district because you pass policies. We'll talk a little bit more about what that means and what those policies should include. But yes, you decide policies and you make sure that they are enforced and they're followed. Anything else? Think about, do you guys have any role with respect to deciding what happens to members of your school community, teachers, administrators, students? When do those issues come at you, if at all?
Well, they come to us, because the community brings them to us,
Mm-hmm.
but our responsibility goes back to Lisa,
Yep.
not beneath Lisa. Our first and only communication should be through Lisa.
So that's a really important point, and we'll talk about the way that communications should flow when they come to you. There are certain times, however, we talked about your role as legislature, right? You make laws, which are policies. You also have a role as judge. And so really the only time when you guys make decisions about staff members and students is when there is a teacher who is recommended or an administrator who is recommended for termination by Lisa. And then the board or an impartial hearing officer appointed by the board, which I think is normally what happens here, although teacher termination hearings are rare, decides whether that teacher should be fired. With respect to students, when a student is recommended for expulsion by Lisa, that also comes to you or to an impartial hearing officer appointed by you. So those are the only times when you guys deal with staff issues and student issues directly. There's one more time. Does anybody know what happens if Lisa thinks that a member of your non-certified staff, so your non-certified staff is anybody who is not a teacher or an administrator, so your custodians, your cafeteria workers, your secretaries. When somebody in that role needs to be terminated, does that come to you? Does anybody know? Do you have any say in that? How is that different? The answer is that it doesn't have to come to you. So decisions regarding the termination of teachers and administrators have to come to you or a hearing officer appointed by you. But all other decisions could come to you if the staff member grieves it under their contract. And we'll talk a little bit later about how grievance hearings are very different from termination hearings. So what other roles do you guys have? We talked about policy, your role in a quasi-judicial capacity.
Can I jump in for one?
Yeah, please.
Can you go back to policy for a second? And
Sure.
again, that's a big word. So when you say decide policies, can you give me like an example of that or a
Yeah,
case
we'll
study or
talk.
something?
It's a good
Great.
question. I have a whole slide on
Okay,
that. I'm
brilliant.
just kind of giving an overview. And we'll
Brilliant.
talk a lot about policy. So your role making policies, your quasi-judicial role, your role passing the budget or setting the budget. Anything else? So we covered most of this, but basically you are not an agent of the town of Weston. You are your own political subdivision of the state of Connecticut. So there are ways that you interact with the town and that you rely on the town, for example, for funding. But otherwise, you are a political subdivision of the state, and it is your responsibility under the law to implement the educational interests of the state. So one way that a community member could complain about your work as a board is to file it's called a Section 10(4)B claim that you have failed to implement the educational interests of the state. The most common way that this comes up is in the bullying context. So actually now there was a change in the bullying law that says that when there's an allegation of bullying and you verify bullying, you have to let both sets of parents know, the parents of the perpetrator and the parents of the victim, you have to let them know of their rights under that statute 10(4)B to appeal to the State Board of Education, claiming that the board did not implement the educational interests of the state, which are to prevent bullying, in part, among many, many other things that are set forth in
And how
the
are we
statute.
aware of the complaint?
It would come to you and it would go to the board. You know, it's almost like a legal proceeding. It's almost like a lawsuit.
No, but it would generally go to the superintendent,
Sure,
who has to make us aware of it,
yes,
unless we're aware of it directly.
right. And normally, people who complain copy everybody, the board and the superintendent.
Notice that.
Those are rare. You know, I've seen more, there's litigation around bullying, but I mentioned that just as an example of there is a mechanism for members of the community to complain that the Board of Education isn't implementing the educational interests of the state. So as we talked about, your role is to employ and act through your superintendent, who serves as your chief executive officer. Sometimes your role is to directly employ teachers, but that role is usually delegated to your superintendent. I don't know how it works here in Weston. But you are the employees of your certified staff, your teachers and your administrators. We talked about establishing policies and also establishing the budget. We talked about your quasi-judicial role. And then there are some other things that are related to your budget setting function, which is to participate in collective bargaining. So you just had bargaining with your teachers and your administrators, and you had a committee that worked on those negotiations. That committee, and we'll talk a little bit later about committees, but committees generally, and I think this is how it works here too, are appointed. They're established usually by the chair, and they work on small issues that are then later taken to the full board for action. So committees are not empowered to act on behalf of the board. They could be if the board chose to have them function that way, but typically committees spend time working on an issue like negotiation, and then the contract comes to the full board for approval or ratification. Facilities review, which I know has been a hot topic for you guys lately. Community relations, and in fact, you have a policy, it's policy 1000, that talks about your role in community relations. It says the role of the Board of Education in community relations is to increase, this is your policy here, this is not a state statute, but your own local policy, is to increase public understanding of the school system, to increase community confidence and interest in the school system, to promote effective dissemination of information concerning school activities, to solicit community opinions about the school system, to encourage the sharing of resources among civic and community organizations for the benefit of the school system. So in short, you are a liaison between your community and the administration. That's part of your role.
Jessica, which document were you reading off of for that?
My own notes.
Oh, your own
This
stuff.
is your
Okay.
policy
Yeah, yeah.
1000. I just took some notes on your particular policies. And if you want to take notes on what I'm saying, I have this little note slide. So if you want to write down
Yep.
policy 1000, that's cool. Curriculum review, I added that a couple of years ago when curriculum became a hot topic among boards of education. So we'll talk about what your role is with respect to curriculum review. And finally, you do have the responsibility to evaluate yourselves annually. Do you guys do that? Do you conduct self-evaluations? Yep. So interestingly, does anybody know whether that self-evaluation has to happen in public?
Didn't we just do it? So
What?
we
I'm
we
sorry.
did an evaluation. Oh, no, that was Lisa's evaluation in public.
Lisa's is in public.
Self-evaluation of the board.
Of the board. It's a trick question because it has a two-part answer.
It's only the board members, right?
I'm sorry,
For the board members?
both. So
Oh,
there,
okay.
you're getting at it. So there are two parts usually to a board self-evaluation. It doesn't have to be this way, but typically part of the board self-evaluation is the board reviewing itself as a whole and its function as a whole. Did we achieve our goals for the year? How are we doing with respect to working toward fulfillment of our strategic plan? How are we functioning as a board? That piece of it has to happen in public. But also usually boards conduct reviews of individual board members. It's not required, but it's something that boards generally do. And there are different ways to do this, which is outside the scope of what I'm talking about today. But under the Freedom of Information Act, you can have the reviews of individual board members occur in executive session, provided that each member would have the right to make that discussion public, which is true anytime you evaluate or talk about a personnel issue. So if you have Lisa's evaluation, for example, that would occur in executive session unless Lisa wanted to have that happen in public. So that's what happens.
And what about a review of an employee?
Mhm.
Is that always an executive session?
So executive sessions are appropriate for the discussion of the performance, appointment, review, et cetera, of any person.
Yep.
Provided, so yes, that would be appropriate, but you have to tell that person that they have the right to make that discussion public
Right.
under
But
FOIA.
But it's not public and the employee says, no, I'd rather have it in executive. session."
Correct,
Thanks.
correct.
Jessica, back on that separate 1 second, what is strategic planning involved?
So strategic planning, it really differs depending on by board.
Mhm.
And it's the way that boards decide, let's look into the future. Let's look over the next 5 years and decide what do we want to accomplish as a board.
Okay.
So it could include really anything, facilities, budget, curriculum, anything that the board decides, this is how we want to plan for the next 5 years.
Got it.
Jessica, when you do a self-appraisal or self-reflection, I'm assuming there's standards that you use to reflect on the overall review of the board or individual members, right?
Well, so interestingly, usually that's included in the policy. For example, I'm working with a board right now on their self-review, and their policy talks about 8 different pillars that need to be incorporated into that self-evaluation. Frankly, I think that there are too many because it's very hard to cover all of them as a practical matter. If you don't have a policy on that, then really it's up to the individual board to decide how they want to conduct that review. So back to your question about policy governance. So I'll just ask all of you, are you all familiar with your policies? Do you know where they live? Do you know how they came to be? Melissa, I know you've been on the policy.
Melissa's on the
You are
committee.
on the policy committee.
I'm pretty
She
familiar.
chairs it. so-
Yeah.
But I know where to find them.
Yeah, they're online.
Yeah.
They're online. So, which is important because because you are a public agency, it's really important that your members of your school community, your staff members, your students, members of the public in certain circumstances, be aware of your policies. Because if you are going to discipline a staff member or a student, it will have to be because they violated a rule. And that rule is a policy that you guys have set forth. So one of the fundamental principles of due process, which is a federal constitutional concept, is that the person who's going to be disciplined has to be on notice of the rule that they're violating. And the best analogy I can think of, because I'm a mom, is, when I punish my kids, I can't punish them for something if they didn't know that they were going to do it, that was wrong, right? So you have to tell people, you tell your staff members, you tell your students, it's not okay to, it's not okay to vape in the bathroom, right? That's common sense, but that's part of your policy. That's part of your student handbook. So with that student were to be expelled, then we would put into evidence the policy that says vaping isn't okay. Another thing that comes up with employees is, and this isn't always, I don't know that it's in your policy, but it's if you get arrested off campus, right, for something you're doing off duty, you have to let the administration know. Very few boards of education have a policy on this. And so it always, whenever it happens, that's kind of a signal to the board to say, okay, let's put a policy into place saying that this is a requirement. So sometimes it's hard to discipline people for that. And we try to get around it. We say, well, you had an ethical responsibility to do that. But it's hard to punish somebody if you don't have a policy saying if you get arrested, you have to let the administration know. So your policies, you have a bunch of policies in place. So what is it that Melissa works so hard on a monthly basis or a weekly basis or however often you meet? What are you doing with the policies? So, yeah, if you want to answer.
We meet with, whoever's impacted by the policy in the school district to give us a sense as to whether it's being applied in a way that works for Weston. We listen to feedback from our outside counsel in terms of regulations and things that are coming down from the state that need to be implemented in Weston. We'll take a look at those policies and see if it needs to be tailored with input from our administration in a unique way that better suits Weston. We discuss the policy at our committee, and then we discuss it at our board meeting. That way, both the board members and the town have the opportunity to reach back out before it becomes, we have a 2-pass system, or first read and then a second read, so that we have the opportunity to receive feedback. We use our meetings to think about areas where we don't have a policy in place that we might need to have one. We did our sustainability policy with Jessica's help last year or the year before, which was kind of a new area for us. So
Yes.
that's kind of how we
And how
operate.
often do you review our policies?
Yeah, so we have Shipman, you mean Shipman and Goodwin?
Yeah.
We have a model policy service that I know you guys subscribe
yeah.
to. And that's a good segue into my explaining our philosophy of policies. So our philosophy of policies is that, first of all, there are certain policies that you're required to have by law. For example, a bullying policy and a safe school climate plan. And those are just a no-brainer. You have to have a policy. That policy, though, isn't handed to you typically by the state, so you have to create it. That's where we come in. My firm, we create model policies that are the policies, in essence, that you're required to have by law, and we stick to the letter of the law. We try not to go above and beyond what's required by law. And the reason for that is that you have to, it's important that you establish policies that you are able to fulfill and to implement and to adhere to. So you can see on my slide, your final responsibility with respect to policies is to make sure that they're being followed. If you set a bar for yourself that's so high that it would be impossible to implement with fidelity and consistently, then the violation of that policy could be considered negligence per se if somebody were to bring a lawsuit against you. So it's important that you follow the law. You're required to do that, but to not to go above and beyond it unless there's a reason to. So a good example is your sustainability policy. That's a policy that you're not required to have by law, but that's something that you as a board think is very important. And that's perfectly fine. It's just whenever I advise, I always say, let's look at the policy from the perspective of, let's talk with the administration, as you said. Let's get feedback for the people who are going to be responsible for implementing the policy and ensuring that it's followed, to make sure that we're not setting ourselves up for a claim that we didn't follow our own policy. So to answer your question, we review our policies every year because every year the legislature makes changes to the law that impact education and that necessarily impact your policies. And so what we would do every year is we modify our existing policies depending on what has changed in the law. Again, I'll use bullying as an example because that law seems to change every year. So in 2019, the bullying law was changed, and the change took effect in 2021 to remove the requirement that acts be repetitive in order to constitute bullying. And now a single act can constitute bullying. So that was obviously a really dramatic and critical change that we needed to make in your bullying policy.
And that was done by the state legislature?
Yes. It was done by the state legislature, but that is not, those changes are not self-executing when it comes to your local policies. And so what happened was that change took effect right in the middle of COVID.
Mm-hmm.
So most of my clients did not actually keep up with the change with their which is fine, right? It is what it is. But what happened was people were focused on COVID, and then there was a bullying allegation, and we went to look at the policy, and the policy still talked about repetitive acts. So it's that kind of lag that we want to try to minimize. And that's what the important work of the policy committee does, is to make sure that you prioritize the policies that need to be changed immediately because they have immediate impacts on the school district. So when I work with policy committees, the chair of the committee always says, okay, what should we do first? And so I help them prioritize. Sometimes there are legislative changes that require the implementation of a new policy. So for example, just recently, there was the requirement to create a policy on the fulfillment of FAFSA applications, the federal financial aid applications. And so we created a FAFSA policy. And that's also an important thing to keep up with, even if that's not something that would come up routinely for every student in Weston. You do, again, as an agent of the state, a political subdivision of the state responsible for implementing the state's educational interests, you have to put in place policies that you're required to have. So, and then again, getting back to the idea of there's certain policies that you have to have, there's certain policies you have to modify because of legislative changes, but then there are policies that you might want to have. And, another policy that we've created, sometimes clients will ask us to create policies because it's just something that's important to the school district. So many clients have asked us to create a social media policy. Many clients have asked us to create a hate-based conduct policy. And I think you guys actually have that policy.
We do.
And so those are, I'm trying to think of other policies that you're not required to have, but that are nice. Civility policy. We don't happen to have a model civility policy, but dress code policy. I don't know that we have a model dress code policy, but that's one that is very useful to have. And again, the difference between a required policy and a useful policy is a required policy is one where the state law says boards of education must adopt a policy that says X.
Mm-hmm.
And then useful policies, again, the dress code policy is useful because you might not want kids wearing crop tops in high school. But if you don't have a policy that says no crop tops, again, it's going to be really hard to say no crop tops and to punish somebody for wearing a crop top.
Jessica, what happens in the case if there's a contradiction or conflict between a state change in a policy and our published policy? Which policy becomes the controlling policy?
It's a good question. So we'll use the bullying example. Absolutely, the state law has to control. And that's where I come in. I help finesse that, right? And so I experienced this. There were some bullying allegations. We had to go through a bullying investigation. The published policy on the website was out of date. And so we basically said, we didn't present the policy. We said bullying is defined. Here's the Safe School Climate Plan. Bullying is now defined as this, and we had to finesse it. So it's not impossible to finesse it. It's just not ideal. The same thing happened a lot with Title IX. So federal Title IX law changed in 2020 very dramatically, and it took school districts a long time. You guys actually did it rather quickly, thanks to Tracy. She was on that. But federal Title IX law changed very dramatically, and school districts had sexual harassment laws that were just totally out of date. And we had to finesse. I'm still finessing that from schools for some school districts that have policies that are out of compliance, and then it's going to change again. So short answer is the law always controls, but the challenge becomes when somebody claims, oh, I didn't know that, right? That's not the policy on your website.
So what's the difference between a law that affects education and what the Connecticut Department of Education does on its own?
Yeah, so that's a good question. The legislature makes the laws, and often they are don't really reflect the administrative realities of how you work, which is challenging.
I'm surprised that bullying is a law
Yes.
that the legislature would spend any time
Yeah.
adjudicating that versus the State Department of Education. So,
Right. Yeah. So the State Department of Education creates guidance where they're required to. So sometimes the law says, and we delegate responsibility to the State Department of Education to create guidance around this issue.
Mhm.
An example with bullying is the state was supposed to create a plain language statement of people's rights to appeal under Section 10(4)B, what I mentioned before. They still haven't done it. And so we've created our own version of it, but the state is often given express responsibility to promulgate regulations or establish guidance. Sometimes they're not given that authority by the legislature, but they do it anyway because there's a need for it. So for example, a couple years ago, the legislature decided that students could take 2 free mental health and wellness days. And that wouldn't be counted as an unexcused absence. They can just be absent from school for 2 days for mental health reasons.
The legislature.
The legislature
And
said
that's
that.
still part of the 10 though, right?
Well, that's the question.
Yeah, right?
That became the question, and
But
that
who-
was a
who-
gap.
Who brings that as an example to the level of the state legislature? Why would it reach that?
You know what?
Somebody, it's a representative decided to push it, right?
Yeah, it's how the laws get made. It can come from
How
really
a bill
anywhere.
becomes
It's
a law,
special
right?
interest groups, some unions, you know,
It's gonna solve all.
the CEA, the Connecticut Education Association, has special interests. For example, the prohibition on dual instruction, teaching both remotely and in person simultaneously as part of a remote learning model. That was something that was pushed by the Connecticut Education Association. Sometimes there's the special education parent group that pushes certain things. There are different special interest groups that get elevated. And some years they don't make it in and some years they do.
Mhm.
So that's really what happens. But Lisa, you make a good point, because with the mental health days, you are considered to be truant if you have 10 or more or over 10 unexcused absences. And the question was, how do mental health days count? Do they count toward the 10 or do they not? And so the state stepped in and put out some guidance around how to count those mental health days. I can't honestly remember off the top. I think
it's
they
hard.
count because they're excused.
Yes.
They're excused, but it's not like you're there, right? You're not counted in attendance. But I
And
think
people
it's,
here in this community know it. I mean, I know that people follow it and they know it because,
Self-declared?
yes,
you don't have to, you just say, this is it. I'm taking this for this reason. So I'm going to move on from policy unless there were more questions about that.
Oh, just one quick thing.
Mhm.
Correct me if I'm wrong. Shipman and Goodwin provides support to school districts around the new policies that are updated on a yearly basis, correct?
Yes. So every year we push out a minimum of, usually it's 2.
Mhm.
I happen to work with our small policy group. So usually it's 2 updates. And
Right.
we have a memo that summarizes all the changes. And since you're model policy subscribers, you get the
Mhm.
memo and they come along with red lines. So you can see what we've changed. And then they would go to your policy committee. Your policy committee would review them. Then they would go to the full board for approval. We often do that twice because sometimes there are changes mid-year,
Mhm.
or sometimes we just change things because we notice things in our review process. And we try to save everything so we're not pinging you every
Yeah.
month, but sometimes we have a third update if there are certain things we need to clean up.
That's helpful.
But if you see something progressing through the legislature, do you make us aware of it?
So
Or if you
there's,
see something before whatever the relevant committee is in
Yes.
Hartford, do you make us aware that there's a potential, if it's truly impactful?
what we do is when the legislative changes are made in June, we put out a legislative update, which is about 20 pages long, typically, depending on how many updates there are.
Yeah.
That precedes our model policy update because our model policies always lag behind the legislative changes. We need time to modify the policies. We do not put out alerts about things that are coming down the pike because it's so very much subject to change. Things can get, tossed at the Senate level. But you will absolutely get an update about legislative changes before we push out our updates to the policies. And we also go around we usually offer this free of charge to anybody who wants to sign up. We do a legislative update verbally. We do a presentation to anybody who wants to sign up. But a lot of my clients ask me to come in and give a legislative update to the board and or the administration. So being aware, it's a good question because being aware of those changes is really critical for you guys as a board and obviously for you guys as an administration, and that filters down to your staff. So curriculum review. Does anybody know what your responsibility as a board is for developing curriculum? And first of all, what is curriculum? This is a big mystery and source of confusion for everybody, but what is curriculum?
Isn't it like either like the stuff you teach or how you teach that stuff?
Both. Yeah, exactly. And curriculum can be broad, very, very broad. It could be, what are your program of instruction? What courses are you required to teach? It can be a little bit more narrow. Are we teaching geometry? Are we teaching, calculus, or what kind of calculus? Multivariable, and then it can be the kinds of tests that you give. It can be the worksheets you give. It's really all of that. So what is your responsibility, if any, as a board for deciding what gets taught?
I don't think we decide what gets taught. The school does.
So the answer actually is that you are responsible for establishing a school district curriculum committee. That's in the statute. And that committee can consist of anybody that you choose. That is your responsibility, and that committee that establishes your curriculum. Now, the statutes set forth the program of instruction that you're required to teach as a school. Every school district in Connecticut has to teach certain things, and it's a very, very long list. How those things get taught is decided by your school district curriculum committee.
But not the board?
Well, it could be anybody. So typically,
No. But what my point is, we have a curriculum committee. Is the curriculum committee the sole determinant, or does the curriculum committee, I'm looking at Melissa, come back to the board with their recommendation?
well, it's up to the board, but typically they're the sole determinant. Your responsibility is to establish a committee. Usually that committee consists primarily of educators, people who are experts in curriculum. Sometimes it has board members. I just worked with a board the other day, and I was actually surprised to hear that the committee consisted of many board members. That's fairly unusual, in my experience. Most districts leave it to the educators. Sometimes, it's really up to you. Sometimes it could come back to you, but do you really want it coming back to you? These educators sit and they write out, the scope and sequence, and it can get very granular. And so the statute, again, is very, very lean in terms of what it says your responsibility is as a board with respect to curriculum, except for that. And I'm sorry.
No, you go ahead. I was going to ask a question, but please finish your sentence.
Well, just the other part of this statute, and this gets at your question, is the statute says that the responsibility of the committee is to recommend, develop, review, and approve curriculum. So I often get the question, well, does the committee do all of those things? How does it develop and approve and review? And so sometimes there is a multi-layer process. Sometimes the committee does everything, but really that's up to you as a board.
So I know the board does have a curriculum committee. I know Bernie's on it, but you said, I think, that part of the job is to create such a committee, and it sounds like anybody could be on that committee.
Yes.
So how do you determine how many folks, and a mixture of parents or professionals, or that sounds a little bit like some wiggle room there.
There is.
Yeah. Okay.
There is.
We have a curriculum committee in place already.
Sure, but does the curriculum committee does that have, because you're suggesting it can involve educators, community members?
So in my sense from working with boards is that most boards have a curriculum committee that consists of a couple of board members, but that's different from what most boards establish. And I don't even know if most boards understand what they're doing when they do this, but most boards have in my experience, boards have board member curriculum committee, and then a group of educators that works on the nitty gritty of the curriculum.
And that's the school district curriculum committee on
That's
the
what
slide
it's,
right there.
yes. Your curriculum committee, I'm imagining that they think about broad, strategic vision, right? And they kind of give feedback probably to the educators about what they want to see.
And
But
the
they're not.
educators present to the curriculum.
Well, yeah, like new
committee
course
and outcomes.
proposals,
Yeah.
textbook adoption, things like that.
Right.
What I always think of when I think of this too is how close it's tied to policy because of graduation requirements.
Yes.
And all of that. And so
Yes.
when the state gives us an unfunded mandate that says we have to offer a particular course, for example.
Yeah.
And that's by, I don't know what, state statute or whatever.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of one course
Asian
that,
Pacific Islanders.
yeah,
study.
and we have the one on, Latino
Latino.
and, and I was told, I said, can we embed it in in other courses. No, you have to order or offer a separate course. Well, we don't have anyone that will take it. You know, we barely have not been able to generate enough enrollment to take it. 3 people sign up. As long as it's on the books, which
Right.
it's another one of these unfunded mandates, but it's sort of curriculum through the back door, I guess.
Well, you make a very good point, because I think that there is sometimes a misunderstanding that the board has carte blanche to create whatever curriculum it wants. That's not true. Most of your curriculum, your course requirements are set by statute, and they're numerous, and there is really not a lot of wiggle room
Yeah,
there.
The statute is set by state.
The statute is set by the state,
Mhm.
by the legislature. And I actually, in my own notes, I didn't print this for you, but I can just show you a visual. This is the list
Oh, yeah.
of courses that and it's growing, as Lisa
Mhm,
said. It grows every year. Now you have to offer this course. Now you have to offer this course. There are certain courses that you are required to permit parents to opt out of if they
Oh, like
so
health.
choose, like health, right? Certain parts of health,
Mhm.
family life and AIDS education, and et cetera. But you have to offer them.
So if this curriculum committee approves a curriculum that turns out to be controversial to the community, what's the responsibility of the Board of Education then?
Well, what do you think? What do
Sounds
you
like,
normally do?
sounds like to
Well, I'd
recommend.
go
it-
back to Lisa, of
Yeah.
course. Right.
Yeah, I think so. Let's just play this out. If a community member made a complaint about a part of your curriculum, you actually have a public complaint policy. It's policy 1312. And I helped work on that policy. And the policy spells out very clearly which issues come before the board and which issues get referred to the superintendent and to the administration to address. And so because that's something that happens at the class level and at the school level, that would be worked out by the administration in the first instance. But there are certain circumstances where issues could come to you as a board to decide. They're very rare because they have to be things that have no other process that's outlined. And, you know, you can look at your public complaint policy, but that sort of thing, I have it printed here. The policy and the related regulations do not apply to complaints that are subject to a process governed by statute, regulation, contract, other board policy, and or procedures set forth outside this policy. For example, complaint processes related to residency, special education, student conduct and discipline, et cetera. So,
If I could add to, you know, curriculum is multi-layered, right? It's really not just the what and the how. It's also the assessment part of it. It's all packaged together
Yes.
when you say curriculum, right? And so there's a lot of layers when you look at content areas, grade levels, course trajectories, like what does the K-12 trajectory look like in certain areas, not just the program of studies at the high school level, let's say. And so I think, you know, in my experience, the Board of Ed Curriculum Committee is almost like, it shouldn't be new when we go to those meetings around what's happening around curriculum development, adoption, review, and research, right? There's a lot of conversation and presentations at the school level in the parent community before we get to that final phase of approval, whatever, because approval typically, you know, I say approval, it's more of awareness when it gets to the Board of Ed Curriculum Committee, like, you know, a final call to be like, any other questions after a year-long almost process of conversation, review, and research that includes a variety of different stakeholders and representatives. I think about the District Literacy Committee, for example. You know, this is a long ongoing process. We're actually having our meeting at the district level. The District K-12 Curriculum Committee is coming together specifically around literacy. So sometimes when we say the District Curriculum Committee, you know, there's many of them, right? Because you don't just have this one District K-12 Curriculum Committee that includes necessarily every content area, because sometimes it's very specific, and we have to be mindful of the people on it and the time that is contributed to a curriculum committee that is really, you know, critical to the work of a school district. So we have many of them sometimes that happen and work simultaneously. And then what happens in the summer, a lot of times what happens in the summer is we come together as almost like a K-12 committee to restructure and reframe how to write curriculum on a standardized level and build capacity with the group that's there. So,
I attended, I'm glad you said all that because I attended, there was a offering for the math curriculum at
Mhm.
Hurlbut that I attended last week, which was
Right.
great because they put the parents through
right.
using manipulatables and
Mhm.
understanding how math strategies work right now, which was really good because I think there is a way in which the more the community knows about that sort of slow drip process you're talking about of
Right.
building curriculum, the better. Certainly as a parent within that community, that's super helpful. So I'm guessing like the literacy question is a good one because I know that's been in the works for quite a while.
Mhm.
I'm guessing part of that is about the sort of like slow undermining of the idea of 3Qing and these sorts of like contextual reading versus some focus on phonics. Like that probably all is like marching along behind the scenes before, because we're down to now 2, right? And then you said the last
Right,
one,
so
2 that you're
The
vetting.
state law now requires that districts adopt one of 6 core curricula that
Mhm.
includes a variety of components embedded within that curriculum, which regarding phonological awareness, phonemic awareness,
Mhm.
word structure, word study,
Yeah.
rapid, automatic, all that stuff. And so the district committee that's focusing on all these are vetting all of these programs, curricula. There's some debate on program versus curricula versus resource.
Mhm.
And so at that point, that committee is going to determine which one to propose
Mhm.
based on all those components.
Yeah.
And then we can start actually having some broader discussion around the explicit aspects of the program with parents and with teachers and on a broader level. Right now, we're still in the research phase.
Yeah, so that all of that is really helpful because
Yeah.
it's a good example of
Mhm.
how the law in many ways is very archaic. You know, this law was written, I'm sure, many decades ago
Mhm.
before, the process that you just explained came into being. It's come up though in recent years because of the focus nationally on curriculum. So
Mhm. Mhm.
I added it to my presentation a couple years ago because I know that that's been a question on the mind of many board members.
Mhm.
One last point I want to make about curriculum is, interestingly, textbooks are really the only thing in the law where you guys are required to take a vote if you are going to change a textbook. You don't have to vote to adopt a textbook under the law, but if you're going to change textbook, that change has to be passed by a 2/3 vote of the board.
Mm.
A question I often get is, what's a textbook?
Well,
Mhm.
exactly.
That's another thing that's really archaic. I mean, we all remember textbooks and carrying them around, but now that's a really outmoded concept.
Well, like, so we have this program, right? We're down to 2. So let's say the committee chooses 1. Then it's not a textbook.
It's
I
not
would
a
still,
textbook
I
in
would
the
still
traditional
imagine it
sense.
has to be voted on now.
Well, that would be up
Or-
to you locally and how you process your curriculum changes. But I do often get the question, what's a textbook? Do we have to
Well,
vote?
exactly.
I can't answer that in a vacuum. I mean, I think I would know it you would know it when you see it.
Mhm.
A textbook generally I would define as the core text that you use to guide a course, half a course, a quarter of a course, but teachers have discretion, right? I'm sure to pick certain texts that they use in class, whether it's articles. I don't know
Mhm.
how granular your
Mhm.
scope and sequence gets, but teachers have certain academic freedom and discretion. But anything that is required to be used as a core text in your courses.
Yeah, and we have a
be a
proposal
textbook.
form and you have to look
Yeah.
at, list the ones we've looked at, goes to the curriculum committee, all that, yeah, and then goes to the full board. right?
Yeah,
Electronic was great.
either way.
Mhm.
Either way,
Yeah.
because a lot
Yeah,
of ours are
gotta be.
electronic now, but it's the same thing.
You said, Jessica, that it is required to vote if it's new.
No, if you change it. If you have a textbook in place and
New
you want to
or.
change it.
Yeah, if you want to,
New
if you
or.
want a new purchase of a text, and
Okay.
usually it happens now because
Mhm.
it's budget
Mhm.
implicated. So now if there was something that would go to the curriculum committee
Mhm.
at this time of year.
I would say, I mean, it's a good question because I would say if it's not a change, but rather it's new, technically it doesn't fall within that statutory requirement because the statute talks about changing a textbook.
Mm.
But arguably, if you have something new, you're probably replacing something.
Yeah, yeah.
Right?
Yeah, I think where it was like a new edition or something like that, I don't think
Yeah.
it's a big a deal, but if you you know, because it's also a significant purchase usually.
Right.
Like, okay, we're buying a new world language program
Mhm.
in the beginning levels. But even that, well, like you said, it's archaic
It's like
because
updated.
we've gotten away from
Mhm.
having the textbook define the curriculum.
Right, right.
Although
So
AP clearly is,
Mhm.
right?
I'm gonna just, because we gotta move on. I know we're an hour in,
We have
but
3 hours.
I
It's
want to
funny.
say, I have many more slides for you. We're only on slide 7. I just want to touch quickly on your quasi judicial function. We talked about your role in teacher and administrator termination hearings and student expulsion hearings, but another thing that would come to you is school accommodations hearings. So I don't think you've had one of these in a while. You've almost had one of these, but when a family argues but tries to enroll in your school district and you say, nope, you're not living in Weston, you're living in Westport, you can't come to school here, they have a constitutional due process right to challenge that. And that it would come before you or before an impartial hearing officer. And that can get appealed all the way to the state and all the way to the Superior Court. Sometimes a student will be enrolled here and your administration will come to learn that they're not actually attending school in West, or they're not actually residing in Weston, they're residing in Wilton. And, you can discover these things any number of ways, right? And so then you go through a process where you'd say, look, you don't have the right to attend school here, and so you have to disenroll. And that family has the right to challenge that in a school accommodations hearing. Parents can also challenge their bus stop and say, or their lack of a bus, and say, I want a bus. I want a different bus stop. That's also a school accommodations issue that would come to you if it ended up there.
Has that occurred? Not school bus stops, but student not living?
Yes.
Yes, and it's very challenging because the onus is on us to prove it, correct?
Yes.
They don't live here, and
Yes.
it's very challenging. You also have to consider if someone is homeless,
Mhm.
so it gets very challenging. It's one of the reasons we put all of the residency out of our office, and Jody handles it, and not at the building level, the school level, because it's much better that it's centralized here.
One quick note about grievance hearings. I mentioned briefly before that your role as the judge in a teacher termination hearing or in an expulsion hearing, you really have to be impartial. You have to be neutral in that role. That's not the case in a grievance hearing. A grievance hearing is more like collective bargaining, where in a sense, you're sitting on the same side of the table as your superintendent, in effect. And so what I mean by that is usually grievance procedures, they're set forth in your collective bargaining agreements. They usually have 4 levels. They go to the principal, they go to the HR director, they go to the superintendent, they go to the board, and then they could go to arbitration before the state or, AAA, for example. But when they go to the board, you'll sit there and you'll hear the grievance hearing. But then you don't have to do this, but I always recommend it. You'll sit with Lisa or whoever the appropriate administrator is, and you'll say, okay, help me understand this. What is your perspective? Why do you think we should rule one way? And that's because that really is collective bargaining, because grievances are a claim that the administration or the board has failed to follow the collective bargaining agreement. So those grievance hearings are part of collective bargaining, but
And so they're not public, correct?
They are so the part where they
Trying to
put on
remember.
the hearing is
Is
public,
public, yes.
but the part where you recess to discuss with Lisa, that's actually a non-meeting, in the same way that negotiations are a non-meeting, because it's for collective bargaining purposes, which is outside the scope of the FOIA meeting definition.
And the hope is in the contract that it's resolved before it goes that far.
Oh, for sure, for sure, but not always.
No, not always.
Not always. So, I said I'm gonna have scenarios. So here's your first one. Yesterday, the local paper published a front page story. Do you guys have a local paper?
No.
Sort of.
Yeah.
No,
I guess it's a
We don't.
blog.
No.
All
we have an
right.
opinionated writer.
Right, that
But he
person,
covers our.
A blogger.
right, that blogger, I forget his name, but I know he is. So he published a front page story about a teacher employed by the district who was arrested for drunk driving. The article, I thought there was somebody else that I'm thinking of, but the article identifies the teacher by name in school. Parents from that school come to the next board meeting, and during public comment, several of them address the board to express concern that this teacher must be fired immediately. A fourth parent who comes up to speak attacks the board for sitting there silently like bumps on a log and asks the board members what they're going to do about this bad teacher. Okay, so the first question is, should you just sit there like bumps on a log and say nothing?
You gave us this scenario last year.
Oh,
I have a prepared answer,
all right.
but I'm gonna leave it to Chad because he's a new guy.
I know that the B is not right, so I know that for sure.
What's B?
Bullet
Maybe the
point
second
two.
bullet, can a board
Mhm.
member reassure the public that the board will
Oh.
fire this teacher?
Maybe you could, but what I've been told is that we don't comment on public comment. So no matter what someone says, you can't be like, let me just respond to your question. You just sit there. So I'm not
And-
sure if you want to characterize it as sitting like bumps on a log, but in the immediate aftermath of the question, we don't respond to it.
That's exactly right. And so typically I always advise, and most boards adhere to this, that you don't respond to public comment, because then you could really get into trouble if you pick and choose what you're responding to. First of all, you can get into trouble with anything that you don't respond to. Well, you responded there. Why aren't you going to answer my question?
Mhm.
But the second reason is it's really a FOIA reason, because if you start responding, you've suddenly potentially violated your obligation to notice your agenda in advance. You have an agenda at a regular meeting, even a special meeting, you have to post your agenda, what you're going to talk about 24 hours in advance. If you start responding to public comment, unless you're at a regular meeting and the board takes a 2/3 vote to add an agenda item, all of a sudden you violated FOIA. If you're at a special meeting, it's even trickier because you can't add agenda items at a special meeting. So that's a further reason why you can't respond to public comment. But yes, typically it's just not a good idea. The other reason, does anybody know why else it wouldn't be a good idea? Maybe you can remember from last year, to comment, to reassure the public that the teacher is going to be fired if he or she is guilty as charged.
I mean, you just don't know what the outcome is, so you can't prejudge it.
Exactly. Bingo. It's a due process issue. I mean, this gets back to the idea of you guys having that quasi judicial function. It's really important. And this is why when there's an issue involving a teacher or an administrator, you really can't know much about it, if anything, because you might be sitting there as the arbiter in a termination hearing regarding that teacher. And so it's not Lisa, doing a bad job of keeping you up to date. It's actually Lisa doing a great job of doing her job. You really can know limited things. Now, what if there's a really egregious situation and you think it's out of control? You really want to be assured that everything is being handled appropriately. It has to do with a teacher. The teacher is accused of something absolutely horrible, right? Pick your poison. And the board's itching to know. Is there any way that the board can or should get information about that situation?
I'm not gonna say, I'm gonna let them speak.
If it touches on public safety, couldn't we have a meeting, an executive session with legal counsel or the chief of police? if necessary?
Well, so you're going to the FOIA point. There are ways to have executive sessions, even if it's a personnel matter. I'm talking more about the due process point. So you guys generally have to be kept, in the dark about teacher matters or administrator matters because they might come to you, but there are certain cases where you might want or need to know what's going on. So I have a little trick for this.
Could you, I'll take a stab at it. If we have the policy that says that we're going to use an impartial hearing officer as far as these things, then because of that, do they have the right to know a little bit more because they're not setting a judgment?
Well, actually, it's a good question, but the impartial hearing officer makes a recommendation to the board.
Oh, yeah.
So that
Okay.
would then, by the way, I've been in a teacher termination case where the impartial hearing officer recommended the termination. And the
Oh,
board
board said no. Yeah,
said no,
yeah, that's right.
which I don't recommend. That's a kind of a PR nightmare. But the answer really is one of you, right? It could be any one of you, could get into the inner circle and learn all about what's going on. But that person would have, so let's say it's Melissa, you'd have to recuse yourself if there were a hearing on the matter. But the rest of you could say, you know what, we feel comfortable, Melissa knows what's going on,
Okay.
we're good, but Melissa wouldn't be able to participate in that hearings. And I've done that, actually.
And then Melissa, I'm assuming, would be tasked with, to the degree that she does need to inform the board of any of this, or is there a firewall she would not? That's the whole
No,
point.
she wouldn't. That's the
Yeah.
point. Because the more of you that get into the inner circle, the fewer of you would be able to sit in ultimate judgment.
But it would be a
Yes.
reassurance to the
Right.
others that someone knows.
Right. And if
That's
Melissa,
interesting.
right, and so it's not something that we do every day. I don't even necessarily recommend it, but I do want to let you know that that can happen. So I can think of one case where that's happened in recent memory, where there was an administrator, a high-level administrator, who there was a possibility that that matter was going to come before the board. And because it was so high profile, one board member was led into the inner circle to hear what was going on. So, and then we answer the question, what can the superintendent tell you about the situation? That was, really nothing unless we use that little trick that I just mentioned. But again, I just want to make clear, I'm not suggesting that happened in every case. That's rare. That's in a rare circumstance. You do have the ability to use that little trick.
Jessica, before you go through additional scenarios,
Mhm.
can you tell us, so one thing that I have been conscious of is that we do typically have board meetings where we look like bumps on a log, especially during public comment.
Yeah.
Regardless of what the comment is. And one of the things that I had said when I joined the board was, I really like to make sure the community knows that we do care, but we are somewhat limited in what we can have in a dialogue, right? So,
Sure.
how do you bridge the gap between public comment where there's no response offered whatsoever, which I think has a terrible perception, and public comment where there can be some level of response, acknowledgement, something so that the person who makes the public comment, whether we agree or not, we get public comment that's sometimes very thankful of
Mhm.
things the board's done. Other times we get, the whole board should be disbanded, and everything in between.
Sure.
So what can a board say,
Mhm.
and who?
Mhm.
Because we typically have, the 7 members typically defer to the chairman.
Mhm.
So what can a board member say, or what can the chairperson say
Mhm.
that basically acknowledges in these various scenarios someone's comment, whether we agree or not, but to basically.
It's a good question. So I have 2 suggestions. Number one is you could say at the beginning of do public comment at the beginning of every meeting about any
Yes.
topic.
Mhm.
So you could say at the beginning, you can have a script that says just that. We welcome public comment. We appreciate the feedback from the community. We do not respond to public comment for FOIA reasons and because we want to, treat everybody's comments equally. If you have a concern or a complaint, you can, take it through the appropriate channels. Basically a script that you would read at the beginning of every meeting so that everybody knows, okay, this is the practice. And then after everybody's comment, I have board members, board chairs, it wouldn't be the individual member, but the chair would say, thank you for your comment.
So what happens next though? So I think it's somewhat tapered off for me. Maybe Chad is a new board member. You'll get them now because people I think just have given up. But I would get emails. I have this concern. I want to bring up a public comment, but it never goes anywhere. I never get a response. I never get a follow-up.
Mhm.
And that's not my responsibility. Matter of fact, emails, we definitely defer to the chair to respond to.
Mhm.
So if someone has a public comment or somebody wants to make a public comment, but really what they're after, I don't think is publicly shaming, or they want some sort of action.
Mhm.
Should people who otherwise want something to take place, are they better if they want to make it in public? Nothing seems to, there doesn't appear to be the ability for them to say, and I would like for the superintendent to do this, or I would like the Board of Ed to do this. Is that if someone makes a public comment and they want to see some sort of action come out of that, is that done at public comment? Do they ask for an action and the board acknowledges it? Or are they supposed to put it in email? How does public comment move from I've gotten it off my chest,
Mhm.
which for some people might be what they really want. They just want to be heard. But other people probably want, I've said what I feel I need to say, but now I'd like to see some sort of follow-up.
Well, the first thing I would say is that it's public comment. So I would hope that a community member would understand that that's not a complaint process. It's not a request process. It's not a channel that they can use to ask a question, really. It's an and this could be in your opening script, right? Or even on your agenda. I have some boards that write on their agenda, public comment is limited to 3 minutes per person. It's used for the purpose of hearing feedback from the public. But, in general, there are different ways that you can make community members aware that public comment is not an opportunity to ask a question or to lodge a complaint. You have your public complaint policy. Many people email Lisa, many people email the board, and usually the board chair will say, thank you, I will be referring your question to the superintendent for response. And then Lisa will say, okay, thank you, I'm going to be referring your question to the principal for response, because generally questions and complaints should be addressed at the lowest possible level. That's a long way of saying that there are avenues for people to use to see something, if they have a question or if they want to make a complaint or if they want to make a suggestion. But I think people need to be reminded, maybe again on the agenda or in your opening script, that public comment is not an opportunity to ask a question or make a complaint. It's an opportunity to make a comment.
Well, and I think what's frustrating sometimes is that if there is an expectation that something is being done, or, okay, so what are you gonna do about it? Like, what's the action? Gee, they didn't do anything. Just because someone makes a comment or suggestion doesn't mean we're going to do something. I mean, that becomes a slippery slope, quite frankly.
Well,
You get email, oh, I want you to do this, or we really need to do that. And then it's like,
That's kind of the basis of my
thank you for
question, is
your
that
suggestion. No, that doesn't necessarily mean we're going to do it,
if somebody
We
wants
have
an
other
action
things.
taken, I think to Lisa's point, I think that's kind of the basis of my question, is public comment is not intended, is a
Mhm.
kind of question
Right.
phrased as a statement, but public comment is not intended to seek some sort of action, right? That's what
Yeah,
you're
I
saying,
think we have to work
Jessica?
on a better
I
statement.
think, yes, that is what I'm saying. And what I'll say further to Lisa's point is that it's rare that a community member would come and say, I want you to do this, just generally in terms of running the district. And then the board responds, the board does it, or the superintendent does it, because you have a
Exactly.
lot on your plate.
Yeah.
And
exactly.
most of what you do is governed by the law, right? And so if somebody wants to make a suggestion, they can do that. And 9 times out of 10, you probably are not going to take it because you can't legally take it or because you're already doing something that you think works. But that's different though than somebody having a real concern or a complaint that has to do with their child, right? There are many processes in place to deal with that sort of thing. But if somebody has a general suggestion, I think you should, come in at a 1% budget increase. Okay, thank you for your suggestion. But you don't have an obligation to go back to that person and say, we did this, right? That's a different story.
I also think by identifying the purpose of public comment and norms around public comment may also remind people that there are certain appropriate public comments and not appropriate public comments. Like there is, correct me if I'm wrong, but there is also specific guidelines around, how you're framing your public comment and whether or not it's appropriate. And that just because you have a platform in which to provide a public comment doesn't necessarily mean that you can just like protest certain things and say it in a demeaning or degrading way, or attacking individuals with names and less generality. Is that correct?
It is. I'm glad you brought that up, because there's also, we worry when we talk about public comment about viewpoint discrimination.
Mm-hmm.
If somebody gets up and starts attacking somebody by name, that is certainly inappropriate. But you can't say that. And then the next person gets up and says, I want to praise Superintendent Barbiero. She's doing a great job. Mm-hmm. Now you are allowing positive comment about an individual, but not negative comment. So you make a really good point, Tina, because the way to deal with that is to say, No
No names.
comments about individual people.
So Westport just had a dialogue between the Board of Education and the town.
Mhm.
That's different than what we're talking about.
Oh,
I didn't
community
participate in that.
conversation.
I don't know if that was a give and take between the board and the community members who participated.
I don't know. I didn't watch it.
It
I
sounds
didn't
almost
attend.
like the town speak up that we had here. But it was, the speak up was, it was like, it included, and correct me if I'm wrong, the speak up includes town officials
Yeah.
as well
Yep,
as Board of Ed.
Yep.
That was a different thing. That was not a board meeting. It was a meeting specifically, I'm guessing,
Community forum.
specifically
It's like a-
designed
yeah.
to have
Mhm.
community kind of involvement. And it was all public comment, I think, right? But that's a different
Well, it sounded like it was a give and take.
A discussion, it sounded like, yes.
discussion. I didn't
Is
watch
that
it.
how the I don't remember the
Speak
last
up is a
speak up I
discussion.
went to. It's a discussion, right? With town officials, including, Board of Ed chair. I believe the superintendent has gone to them.
Yeah.
We haven't had one since I've been here.
So Jessica, just to kind of close the circle on this, I think what you're saying is, for the purpose of public comment, I think setting expectations is the most important thing that we can do, right?
Mhm.
Because when you don't have an understanding of the expectation, then it leads itself to disappointment. Disappointment leads itself to, in some cases, unhappy, and unhappy leads to not nice words. So it sounds to me like the concept of public comment is more for a person to address the board and provide just that feedback. We're doing a good job, we're doing a poor job. I like this kind of curriculum. This course, I don't understand why you teach it. Fine, thank you. But if you want to affect some sort of change, you want to see some sort of action, there's a procedure, and the procedure would start with, preferably at the lowest level possible. You have an issue with a particular class in WIS, contact the principal
Exactly.
and escalate at that point. But if you want to see something take place, you want to see some sort of change, public comment is not the place where you're going to, it's not the right place to say, I want to know why Death of the Southland was taken off the curriculum, and I'm not going to sit down until you tell me why.
Exactly. And if you look at your public comment, public complaint policy and administrative regulations, you'll see how it spells out the process that somebody could follow if they want to make a specific complaint. It's 1312. But I just, public comment, I think, has been used, as you said, to provide feedback. It's also, sometimes it does affect how a board decides, which is why many boards have public comment. So a good example of that was during COVID. There were a lot of things that people had to say about different procedures, policies, practices that boards had in place. And so public comment was used a lot for the masking issue. And I do think that boards listened carefully to what people were saying and responded as appropriate. But that's another way that public comment has come to be used, is to get feedback from the public, to get a sense of the community. What is the community thinking about this? And people won't necessarily directly see the correlation between the public comment and board action. But I do think that in general, there are certain areas for comment where boards say, we want to get a sense of the community. We want to read the room. And people have to understand that they're not going to get a response in the moment. They might not see an immediate result, but you guys are not, your meetings are not meetings of the public. They are public meetings. They are meetings that happen in public, but they're not, but the public does not participate in your meetings.
Yeah, so a good example is sort of like budget cycle. That's a pretty easy one, where we're deliberating over a budget over several months, several meetings, and the public comes and says, I support a 3%, I only can support a 1%, times are tough, you should do a flat. That's essentially what the intent of the public comment is, or helping us, giving comment so that as we deliberate on removing Death of the Salesman, perhaps in curriculum or whatever the case may be, that's the concept of public comment, is to bring ideas to the board that the seven members of the board may not have previously considered as we're deliberating something.
Exactly. it's exactly right. It's not, I don't like what's going on in my school and I want you to do something about that. That's more of a complaint. It's, you're talking about this issue, you're talking about the budget. Here's how I feel about the budget. That, I mean, that's one important part of public comment, and that's why boards have public comment.
Yeah, so we've had someone complain about that on the town side during COVID, where we held a Board of Finance meeting to listen to the public, because we weren't going to hold by executive statute and ATVM. So we held a meeting. Anybody can make comment. We didn't respond back to the comments. Some people viewed that as a de facto town meeting, and on their own tallied up what they thought they heard the various people say for and against. The Board of Finance was challenged to say, well, X percent in favor of the budget, X percent or not. And we went out of our way, I went out of my way to let those who said that was a de facto town meeting, that it was not a town meeting. And we went before the FOIA Commission and they agreed with that. So we never commented, we just listened, and board members went away and formed their own opinion. Some people thought they had heard definitively the way the town felt, but in reality they didn't, because it was just public comment.
So you mentioned a second thing. So it seems like this sort of purpose statement at the beginning is a great idea. That bunch of things, so they know what this is all about. But you said there's a second thing that you recommend. Did I miss that one?
Just so when I observe boards, the chair usually just says after every comment, thank you for your
Oh, I
comment.
see. Okay, that
It's
was
a good way to
okay.
just make people psychologically feel heard. And also it's a good way to put an end to the comment, right? Because
Okay.
they have a time limit. Thank you.
Okay.
Also,
Also, can we take a bio break at some point in the
Oh,
3
yeah,
hour
of
span
course.
of time? I don't know.
Why
if
don't we do
can
it now?
that.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I'll be right behind you on the way out.
It's very helpful. Thanks.
Good.
Yeah, really.
Good. Can you hear me?
Um,
Am I coming in?
Oh, hi, Peter.
Yes,
You're there.
Everyone had a
Welcome.
nice weekend. I have a window here, and I joined exactly at the right time. So when our other members, I'd like to ask our council and Lisa on advice about meetings where the public is part of our commission or our committee, and they are commenting. So we have a educational optimization committee that's been founded that Steve and I sit on, but we have public members and public meetings. So I want to go through that's a very unique case, right? So I wanted to go through that with you, but I'll wait till the
Sure.
other members come back,
Yeah.
because I have an idea of how to capture comments, funnel them in through the parental participants. I want to make sure that it's sanctioned, right? That way it's a little different than public comment.
Is this still recording?
Peter, yes, we are.
Okay.
Good.
I think those are good points,
You
Peter.
can take you can put us on hold for recording, and then when everyone gets back, we can reconvene. But I wanted to not miss this.
I can't stop the recording. If I stopped it and then started it again, it would be a new recording. So I need to let it keep going. So we're gonna take a few minutes break.
Okay. Well, I caught everyone at the right time then, but let's continue my question when everyone returns, and I'll put my camera off for now.
So we're still recording?
Yes, we are.
We can't hear that.
Unfortunately, I can't stop it. No.
There's no stirs.
just didn't want to wear a t-shirt.
Yeah.
So it's very important.
We're now.
Our
we're now
meetings
off
are held in
mute. We can
public.
Continue.
All right, so we had a question from Peter. I don't know, Peter, if you're still on.
I am. Should I repeat it for the group and give you the
That would
setup?
be great. Thank you.
So the setup is that we're initiating a new subcommittee under the Finance, Operations, and Facilities Committee. It's called the Educational Optimization Committee. It sort of builds on where the town's FOC left off. And the constituents, it's constituted with staff, board members, but also two parents. So that means that they're the public. So instead of having public comment, we have two people that are intimate with the workings of the committee. And there's a few things I wanted to cover. One is we can anticipate a lot of input, different than public comment, and certainly different than the emails we get about unique issues for a particular parent or family. But you can imagine everyone, and we anticipate and we hope many people have input, right? Because we're trying to figure out the next 10 to 20 years of educational delivery in the school district. But that has to be managed. So one, we have to manage a lot of information that's a little different than our public comment at our Zoom or in-person board meetings. Two is we have to capture that input, right, for prosperity, right? We want to make sure that no one is left out of the process. So we have a record of it. And the reason I'm motivated to have a record of it, one is we want to sort it, right? There's the curriculum interest, the facility interest, the sports interest. We don't know how many different types of input we want to get. We want to sort it so we can group it and understand it. And also, I want to make sure that if we're ever asked under FOIA to produce our records, we have a really good system in place to say we got public comment, we got comment from all participants, and it can be sorted and it's all there in a record, right? There's no doubt about it, because then it's transparent, right? So my idea is this transcends the past comments that were made about public comment. I want to set up and dance here, which is good, sort of customer relationship management, like NetSuite, where we have a record of who wrote what with some keywords. And we may have 1,000 entries or 100 entries or 10,000 entries by the time this process is finished. And I could sort those. We can understand sort of where things are weighted. And I also want to make sure that the public and the staff and all the participants don't think that the two parents that are involved have a weighted say in this, right? That wasn't the point of them, nor are they representing a particular section of parents. They're there as our conduit to the general public. So I wanted to cover that in this meeting because I want to make sure that we didn't misstep here from the start. So I don't know if there's, as counsel, there's a better legal way of doing it. Maybe Dan, without knowing that I was going to say this, can chime in on how to set this system up. Maybe David's good at this because that's his work, right? His NetSuite system.
Yeah, sure. Let me just take it in two parts. The first part I heard is you have a committee that consists of board members, community members, and others. That is your kind of bread and butter. It's a public agency, right? In the way that any other committee appointed by a public agency, your superintendent is a single member public agency, the board is a public agency, committees of the board are public agencies. That committee is a public agency that is operating as a committee. And, you know, you made the point that you don't want people to think that the parents have more of a say than other parents. That's a separate issue. So let's put that aside for a minute. But the fact is that you as a board have constituted a committee which must operate within the parameters of FOIA and, you know, meet publicly and comply with FOIA and the like, and they do their thing. That is not, however, I don't see that as being any different from what we talked about with respect to public comment. The parents who are on that committee are members of the committee. That's not public comment. They're participating as members of a public agency. So that's part one. Part two, and I see that all the time, by the way, there are different kinds of committees that boards constitute that contain, you know, community members and others. But they, again, that is a public agency itself. Part two of it is what I heard you say is that you want to collect feedback from the public as part of the process of this committee doing its work. And you want to collect it, you know, via Google or whatever it is, you know, electronically and sort it. There's nothing wrong with that. Again, I see that as different from public comment that you receive at board meetings. That is part of what this committee may decide to do as part of its work. All of those comments would be, generally speaking, subject to disclosure under FOIA unless some sort of exemption applies. For example, if somebody's talking about their child and it's FERPA protected. But that, again, is different from what we were talking about before in receiving public comment verbally at a meeting or even in writing, as happened during COVID. What you're talking about is something that this committee decides to do to inform its decision-making process. And you may or may not respond to it. You're going to take it back, you're going to process it, you're going to review it. Presumably it will inform the committee's decision-making process. But again, I put that in kind of a different category. Does that help?
Well, you still did very nicely. So we're in a good position with respect to having that parental participation as members of the committee. And in my view, they're the conduit to the community, sort of to bring many views in. And if we can capture those views and use them productively. But again, I also don't think we will respond to each entry into our NetSuite, for example. I think we will confirm that it's been made an entry, but I don't anticipate having an exchange based upon that input. It will just be one of many inputs that will be under consideration.
Yeah, and I would say that
Public comment. Please.
No, I would say that it's important that you not respond. And the reason that it's important you not respond is, number one, the reason we talked about before, because which ones are you going to respond to? I think you either respond to some of them or none of them. I mean, all of them or none of them.
Right.
But number two, you have to be careful about illegal board meetings via email, which is something I'll talk about later. So it's important that the board understand that when a quorum of the board is communicating via email, that could be considered a meeting. So, if you start engaging in these meetings with individuals as a board, that could get you into FOIA trouble. So I think those are two reasons why it would be important not to engage, but rather to collect, if that's what you choose to do, these comments.
Peter,
Go ahead.
oh, sorry. Peter, just want to, since you invoked my name, I get at least a 1 minute response. I don't know why I'll put it out there. I don't know why you're putting so much effort into this concept of collecting contact information and a CRM. People should just email you if you want, as the chair of the EOC, of the EOC, where your emails are captured by the town, and or they should attend your meetings and listen. But generally speaking, at committee meetings, we don't do public comment. So if you, and I don't know, Jessica, if that's worth mentioning, but at committee meetings, we don't generally do it. As a matter of fact, we've been asked on a couple occasions, somebody has raised their hand, and we have said we don't do public comment during committee meetings. And I'm not sure if that is a procedure or what, but maybe.
That's typical. That's, board by board, you could decide, but that's typical. I guess I'm not quite understanding what the vision is here. If we're talking about public comment via email, that's one thing, but what I thought Peter was saying was he almost like he wants to conduct a survey.
Yeah, that's what I understood.
Yeah, eventually the input will constitute a survey, right? And in fact, I envision not having my email address as the contact information, but maybe having Dan set up a ECO input at westonps.org email address. So we have one place everything goes to. And the reason I
That's a
want,
good idea.
right? So just say, go there, right? Don't say it to Steve. Don't say it to Peter. Don't say it to Lisa. That's our filing cabinet for all input. And the reason I wanted some sort of relationship management is I wanted keywords, because if we get a lot of email, I want to be able to sort by topic, right? Like here's a bunch that's on parking. Here's a bunch that's on math. Here's a bunch that's on pre-K through 2, right? So that way our conduit Inc. could sit there and go, we had a lot of comments about how to reconfigure Hurlbut because of this issue. Then I could just go right to them instead of sorting through 1,000 emails.
Just an observation. I think that the difference between what you're describing and what we talked about before is you're describing something where the board is soliciting feedback for to inform its work, right? That's different from having the opportunity for people to say whatever they like in public comment. You're deliberately soliciting feedback on specific topics. That's why I said it sounds like a survey. But I put that in a different category. You're not required to do that. You're not prohibited from doing that. The one thing just to keep in mind is that all of that is going to be subject to FOIA, generally speaking, unless it's somehow exempt.
Yeah, that's why I'm just from a tech perspective, Peter. I think that you are overcomplicating something that you don't necessarily have the bandwidth or desire to. I think the distribution email address is a fine idea, but creating a ticketing or a CRM system or something in NetSuite, now that becomes FOIA-able as well. Now you've got to figure out, is NetSuite or whatever system you use, is that compliant with being able to run FOIA requests? So I think you're probably not necessarily within Jessica's area of, we don't need Jessica on this piece of it, just that whatever information is collected has to be available to the public, and Peter nor a member of his committee should be responding to requests outside of a public forum, right?
Correct.
So I think you should just stick to your distribution email address and
Gather, use it.
yeah,
I think
use that as-
also creating a survey, if the goal is to gather feedback, right, by building a survey and asking very specific questions also helps you kind of lead the feedback that you're receiving in a way. so that it's organized and structured in a way so that you could then take that Excel file, let's say if it's just a typical Google form or survey, then you could still, from what I know from just on the back end of Google, you could still search and look for patterns and trends relative to the responses that you get. And that may still, be sufficient based on what you're looking to do. I don't know, just an idea.
Yeah, I don't want to move beyond the objective of this morning's meeting, but I wanted to take the opportunity to ask because I have to task or request that the parents involved in the committee, right, have a productive function, right? And mine was to be the final distillation of input from the community in a digestible way, right? So I'm just looking at digestible ways.
Yeah, absolutely.
It becomes useful to us, right? Because then everyone knows they've been part of the process, and ultimately that some will be implemented and they've been listened to. But I think I got the cover I'm seeking on enabling parents to participate, their function as I've defined, and capturing information and storing that information so it's available for future reference or scrutiny if necessary. The only last question I have with respect to this, and I'll let people move on to the next part of the presentations, is what do you do if you get threatening email into our mailbox, right? So we can envision not everyone's going to be positive, happy, productive, creative. They're going to be on the other spectrum, right? What's our legal, if any, responsibility of showing that to people that may have to take action on it?
It depends on what the threat is. There are different kinds of threats. If there's a threat, if there's a physical threat, or if there's a threat to health and safety of the school community, send it to the police, send it to Lisa if it's something that's not a police issue. But if somebody's just complaining and cranky, I don't know that you have any responsibility to do anything about it. You receive it. It's one of the comments you get. But if there's anything that is a threat to the health and safety of the school community, send it to the police and let Lisa know. That's not an issue for the board to deal with. As just getting back to what we started with, you guys are, generally speaking, you are the overseers. You don't deal with the day-to-day issues of the district. A safety issue is a classic example of a day-to-day issue of the school district that is not, I'm sure you'll all breathe a sigh of relief, that is not your responsibility. So speaking of that, I skipped the other scenario. I just want to kind of move along a little bit. I want to talk quickly about the role of individual board members. We talked about your role as a board. As individual board members, how much authority do you have as an individual?
0.
Right. You don't. You have authority as a member of a board. You have a vote, which is very important, but you can't act as an individual unless you're somehow empowered to do that by the board. If the board delegates responsibility to the chair, for example, to take action, to sign a document, then so be it, but the whole board would have to vote on that. You are a member of a team. You have authority at meetings only, whether it's a meeting with the full board or a meeting of a committee, but otherwise you don't have authority. And I think that this may seem obvious, but where it becomes challenging is in situations where you're out in the community and somebody asks you a question and says, hey, you're a member of the Board of Ed. I'd like to know X. How do you respond to that? What do you do? Does that happen to any of you? I, for example, and I have a scenario about this, rather than run through the scenario, I'll just tell you. What if somebody came to you and said, my daughter's in 4th grade and the teacher is just not returning her homework ever. We get no feedback. It's very upsetting. I pay a lot of money to live in this town. You're a member of the board. I want you to do something about that. How would you deal with that situation?
I mean, it does happen. I don't know if it's happened to Chad yet, but it's pretty simple.
Yeah, exactly. You could say, contact the superintendent. If you feel like you absolutely need to say something, you would say, I'll let the superintendent know. But you have
one of the things that we did, and this is where it gets frustrating because we always put the link to our communication protocols on our newsletter every month, it's on the front page of the website, it's on and it says, like, if you have this issue, you talk to this person, then this person, nobody ever looks at it. So I guess what I would say is that's a given boilerplate that you can send out with the link that says, thank you for your feedback. Here is the link to the appropriate communication protocol, somehow but they just go right up. They go to Steve and then they come to me. They go to Melissa and then they come to me.
Yeah, I think so sometimes you'll get complaints or questions via email, and sometimes you'll get them when you're in the, Lily's market,
Oh, yeah,
right? And
yeah.
so, the best way to handle that is to say, look, I'm a member of the board, but you really have to talk to talk to the superintendent. She'll refer you to the right person to talk to.
Yeah.
But then, if you get an email, I think the best practice is just to simply say, thank you for your email. I'm going to be forwarding it to the superintendent for response. Poor Lisa will probably get a lot of those, but Lisa doesn't respond to everything. Lisa will say, okay, I'm going to forward it to the principal. I'm going to forward it to this person.
Yeah.
Because again, the concept is that issues should be addressed at the lowest possible level. Now, what if that very parent comes to you a month later and says, I spoke to Lisa and I spoke to the superintendent, and it's still happening. This teacher is still a problem. Then what?
Oh, they go back to us?
They come back to you, they run into you in the market again.
Same process.
Yeah. And you might, at that point, you might call Lisa and say, look, this sounds like an issue, but you don't have any more responsibility to do anything beyond that. And in fact, you shouldn't. Because again, if this teacher is a problem, you don't really know what's going on, nor should you. But if this teacher is a problem, you have no idea. Lisa and I might be working together on something, and you wouldn't necessarily know that. So it's important to have trust in the process and trust in your administrators to handle issues. So, this is all obvious. You have to participate and prepare, follow communication norms, which we just talked about, act ethically. So maintain confidentiality. This comes up a lot with respect to executive sessions. It's really important. Executive sessions are the importance of keeping the information that is discussed in executive session confidential is really important. It's not just that you all meet in private for certain reasons that are permitted by FOIA, but it's also that you can't talk about that outside of the executive session. So just a quick scenario. I want to just cover the role of the chairperson. So sometimes there are some misunderstandings about what the role of the chairperson is. The role of the chairperson is to preside over meetings, to represent the board. And when I say represent the board, what I mean is that there's certain circumstances, the board can't speak as a whole, right? There are certain circumstances where you need one person to represent the board. And that means that when somebody emails you as a board, it's the chairperson who responds. The chairperson would never respond substantively without board approval, but rather would say something along the lines of what we already discussed. I know you don't have a local paper here in Weston, but if you were ever to get a call from the Connecticut Post, for instance, and you wanted to comment, the chairperson would comment or not, but the chairperson does not have authority in addition to or beyond what any other member has authority to do. The chairperson simply is the voice of the board and reiterates actions that the board has already taken. So if the chair were to get a question from a local paper about what does the board think about X issue, if the board hasn't discussed X issue, the chairperson would say, I can't comment, right? No comment. But if the board just discussed X issue at the meeting last night and came to a consensus and voted, it would be okay for the chairperson to say, well, last night at a public meeting, we took a vote to approve X. So that's what I mean by representing the board. The chairperson liaises with the superintendent. So do you have regular meetings together?
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes other board members participate, but typically what happens is that the chair and the superintendent meet on a regular basis to exchange information. And the chair, it's important to emphasize that the chair is not responsible for managing the superintendent, managing the administration, managing the affairs of the district. or solving problems. Again, the chair is there to make matters more efficient. So here's another scenario. Recently, 3 board members have become very concerned about the new reading curriculum, which we talked about just now, that the state is requiring. I just used the scenario the other day and the board said, how did you know? They actually wrote a letter that the state is requiring and wrote a letter to the Commissioner of Education as members of the Weston Board of Education to lodge a complaint. Some of the other board members do not agree and like the new curriculum. These board members heard about the letter and were outraged that the 3 board members didn't let them know about the letter in advance.
I could tell you the district probably.
So what, sorry?
We'll erase that. I said I'll probably tell you the district.
Oh, it's nowhere near here. So did the 3 board members who wrote this letter do anything wrong?
Not as individuals.
Well, the problem is,
Representing
yeah,
Kind of.
themselves.
Yeah.
If they represented the board, if they
So they're
indicated
quorum.
that, that's a difference, but
Right.
3 individuals.
Yeah.
That's fine.
But they did, right? The quote is as members of the Weston
Yes.
Board of Education.
They wrote as members,
Aren't
they
they a
signed.
quorum to, well, no. 3.
No.
Yeah, they're not a
No,
quorum,
they're
but
not a
even if they
quorum.
were, right, or even if they're not,
It's really not. Heard about this letter and we're outraged.
yeah,
They-
I mean, you're right.
they-
So,
Go ahead. Sorry.
yeah, the answer is that you can't, 3 of you or 2 of you, right, can't write a letter on behalf of the board. And this
Mhm.
goes to the concept that you have no authority as individuals. You can't write a letter on behalf of the board to lodge a complaint on behalf of the board. They could write a letter as themselves and sign their names without mentioning their affiliation with the Weston Board of Education because you don't shed your rights as individual citizens when you join the board. But you can't represent the board unless the board votes to have 3 of you write a letter. And so this is another challenge that comes up. How do you create a communication as a board? And the answer is that it's challenging, right? Because you can't really write a letter in public together. And you can't write a letter over email together because that's a FOIA violation. So the best way to do it is if you want to write a letter of any sort, if you want to create a communication, you take a vote. We're going to delegate responsibility to Steve to write a letter on our behalf, communicating the following points. But it's virtually, it's just not practical to sit there in public and write a letter. And you can't go over email. Steve can't draft a letter and send it to all of you for comment. That's a FOIA violation. That is a little known rule that is violated all the time
Yeah.
in my
Oh, yeah.
experience. And boards are shocked when I tell them this, but it is an issue. And so either you can't write a letter as a board or you have to vote to permit somebody to write a letter. But it would never be the case that you would vote. I mean, it might be the case, but it's rare that you would delegate responsibility to one person to come up with your views as a board. It's more that you would delegate responsibility to one board member to express your views as a board. So
Can-
you vote on the issue.
Can they write a letter in like a working session collaboratively?
Sure, but it has to be in public.
but Jessica, why,
no.
so
Wow.
in the scenario that
No.
that you described, if someone's gonna write a letter, so if a letter is written, and that letter is then sent to the rest of us, and we then we're told, we will discuss this at the upcoming public meeting.
Mhm.
We then have the ability to look at that letter prior to it,
Mhm.
and then at the upcoming meeting. So let's take the example that you gave. There is some matter that the chair is being charged with writing a letter about. The chair writes a letter. Why wouldn't that letter, or could that letter not be shared with the other 6 board members in draft form? And the chair would say, please review the letter that I've sent. We will be sharing it, discussing on it, and making any modifications required at the upcoming meeting, the public meeting on Tuesday.
That's perfectly
With the
fine,
agenda.
but with the following caveats, okay? Number 1, and this is a good time to explain the email rule. Unilateral communications, what you just described, Steve writes a letter, says, we're going to be discussing this draft at the upcoming meeting. That's fine, but you cannot respond to that. Nobody can respond. In fact, I always recommend say, please do not respond to
Yeah, and
this.
subject,
In
exactly.
the email,
I get it.
this is an FYI, just like your superintendent sends you a board packet. It's
Right.
the same concept. But the other thing to keep in mind is that that draft will not necessarily be protected from disclosure under FOIA. There is a protection for preliminary drafts. So it's possible that that would be within that FOIA exemption. But I think it's important for everybody to understand that when you create a draft and you go through different drafts of things, those might be subject to disclosure.
Yeah, I think the intent is, as the chair is singularly writing on behalf of all 7 members. So I think that the intent is, did the chair accurately and fully represent what the board wants to disseminate out there? So if the draft gets out,
Yeah.
Or if the draft is public, in this scenario, I don't see that as an issue.
Yeah.
It's more about the chair writes on behalf of the board, sends the draft to the board, and says, does this accurately represent, blah, blah, blah. We will, do not reply. We'll be discussing this at our Tuesday meeting. No, right.
As long as it's not sent.
No, it's just
The
like
chair
the
doesn't
agenda.
Send a letter and said, oh, by the way, we're going to be discussing,
Yeah, as long as it's not sent to whoever it gets.
whoever the recipient is supposed to be,
Mhm.
before the board discusses it.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, you can do it any which way. It's the key thing to remember is you can't respond over email and give feedback over email, number one. Number two, you shouldn't assume that that draft is going to be protected from disclosure. Number three, when you get to the meeting and you talk about the draft, this is why I don't often see boards talking about drafts of letters. It gets challenging. It gets challenging to write something as a board. So what that means is that either you're not writing things as a board or you're saying this is such a vanilla issue that we've already discussed that we trust one person to just communicate it. Sometimes what I see is I'll see the chair write something. And again, these are just tips. They're not what you should do or shouldn't do. But sometimes I see the chair write something and send it to the board and say, FYI, this is the letter I drafted on this subject. It's going out now. But it's not often that you'll write something long as a board because you communicate generally as a board at your board meetings, right? That's how you communicate with the public. Your superintendent might share things out and your superintendent will draft a summary of a meeting, or if there's a policy that you discussed and approved, she might say, or for example, school start times, that comes to mind. If you change your school start times, then Lisa might write a letter. Last night at our Board of Ed meeting, our board voted to do X. Here's what that means for you. Here's, because again, her role as the CEO is implementation of what you all decide. I can't really think of an example where you would all be communicating directly with the public about an operational issue. There might be some, but I would recommend that you think about whether that's best coming from you or from Lisa before you create an email to the public about it.
I think one thing that's tricky too is just like I try to send something out and I might say, for information, please do not comment. In the subject, the thing that we've gotten into problems with is if I have somebody's personal email somehow or ever it gets in my system and I click on something, and that's why the listservs are good or the distribution list, because if you send it, like I know the former chair had a problem where he used his iPad and it accidentally was like I don't know if it was his father, it was some other email that was attached to it or a personal one. And then the next thing you know, everything is being FOIA'd and it's like, why aren't you using the Weston PS one? And it happens to me. All of a sudden I'm looking, I'm like, I don't want to send it there.
There's no, as far as I know, probably get into, there's no obligation under FOIA to use the Weston PS email.
No, but
You should.
yeah.
It just makes
But
it
there's no-
easier.
And I think that has to be understood. There's no obligation to use a specific email
No,
address. You're not
there's not.
prohibited from using any email address you want. It's just all discoverable.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah, and then it,
Well, then keep in mind too, once the FOIA requests start coming, and they do come, the school searches your school
Not
email
your
address.
personal.
not
Your
personal.
obligation to search your personal. So it's like, you're also incentivized to try and use your own.
Exactly.
It's
Right.
just an easier workload. I have the
Because
same
then it's,
problem.
did you go back? Did you check it? You're going
But
into
every
a
now and
rabbit
then,
hole.
I'll send an email from my work email address accidentally.
Mhm.
I have to
Reverse.
send it to Dan and say, this is I have confidentiality concerns with work, and make sure it doesn't accidentally get distributed via a FOIA request. So,
Mhm.
it's important to use your school email address where you can.
Yeah, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, and I want to be mindful of the time because I do want to cover some more things about FOIA, but I would just strongly advise you to only use your Weston PS email address for the reasons we just said. Also for retention reasons, because certain records are required to be retained for a certain period of time under the municipal records retention laws. If you have a litigation, then you might be subject to a preservation notice where you have to keep certain things. It's just, accidents happen, but do, try to use your Weston PS address. There's nothing prohibiting you from using anything else, but it's just a best practice. Similarly, your text messages are also subject to disclosure if they're about board business. And they're subject to retention requirements as applicable. So take that for what it's worth, but generally speaking, if possible, avoid texting about anything other than what time is the meeting,
Exactly.
where is it being held, where are you,
Yeah.
I'm running late.
We're in person this month, not at home.
Yeah, do not, I just strongly advise you not to text about anything substantive.
Just,
Jessica.
I have this might be like way too granular, but I have a second grader, for example. Her teacher's awesome. She has the kids she put out a thing about buying some equipment. We bought some yoga balls. My daughter's like drawing on an easel and she's up out of her chair and she's using yoga balls and this kind of thing. It's awesome. So I may have even done this, but I'd like to email Lisa, say awesome, second grade teacher's great. As a parent, can I send that email to her from a personal email? As a
Sure.
parent of my kid? Okay.
Yeah.
So you can have a firewall between those sorts of things.
Yes. So
Great.
let me tell you this, and I'm going to tell you a little cautionary tale. You absolutely, as I said, you don't shed your individual rights as a citizen or a parent when you become a board member. But do be mindful that as a board member, you are a public official and people are always going to think of you first and foremost, people in your community, as a public official. So I had a situation recently with a board member whose family member texted him about something that had to do with the school district. And he passed it along to the superintendent. And that whole chain became the subject of a FOIA situation. And so there are certain situations, I don't want to say too much about it, but there are certain situations when what you might think is your personal business isn't, because you are actually acting in your capacity as a public official. And that line can get really gray. So, I say that not to panic you when you're, dealing with your second grader, but just remember that when you, be mindful that when you communicate with Lisa or anybody in the district, think about the difference, whether it's you're doing it in your role as a board member or whether you're doing it in your role as a parent, because that could become a FOIA issue.
The other question I have is I'm very clear on how to protect ourselves in terms of being very buttoned up with all of the sort of things we're trying to avoid. I'm less clear about let's say someone has an awesome idea. Let's say Peter, after thinking through this, determines this survey idea or whatever it is really a great idea. I'm less clear about how as a board we're supposed to advance smart ideas essentially. Does that happen in committee? And then once we sort of gather in a larger context, we never really do that except for just voting on what is presented before us?
So it's a good question. And the answer to it is likely governed by your bylaws, right? And so different boards have different rules around how do you add an item to the agenda? How do you bring things forward? Who creates the agenda? Typically, it's the chair and the superintendent who create the agenda. The agenda governs what you do as what you deal with as a board. So individual board members wouldn't necessarily have free reign to say, I want to talk about this issue or that issue. Even committees, I would think of committees as they're themselves public agencies. So you're not necessarily going to have your own issue taken up in a committee. There's a very specific way that issues get addressed as a board and as a committee. The committee chair is usually the one to create the committee agenda. If you have an issue that you want to bring up in a committee, you can bring it up, but it won't necessarily get airtime. It will depend on what the committee feels should be discussed. So a good example of this is a policy committee. if a board member has an idea for a policy that they want to put on the policy committee agenda, it's not necessarily going to go on the agenda. It will go on the agenda if the committee thinks it should be discussed, but the committee might decide that it shouldn't be discussed. So everything really is subject to the decision of the whole committee or of the board, if it's a board issue, or the process that's established under your bylaws for bringing issues to the attention of the board or the committees.
Okay.
And of course, if you have a suggestion, if you have feedback as a parent, you can email Lisa as a parent, right? But I would just be clear as a board member to say, I'm emailing you as a parent, right? And that's a good way to remind yourself of what role am I serving right now? What role am I filling?
And to that point, maybe Jody, if it's not too much trouble, you could send the bylaws to our new members.
I was just thinking of that because I'm old school. I have a binder.
Nice.
It is very helpful.
Just one more item on FOIA, which hopefully means later on when it gets to the FOIA section, it'll be condensed a bit. So when we get an email from someone for a FOIA request that goes to our public school address, and they want to they go out of their way to state your text messages, your personal device, and so forth. I know that I don't have to take any action because relative to my Weston Public Schools address, which is the address that I exclusively communicate with. But do I have to, and I don't text and I don't use my personal email, but do I as an individual, or should any of us as Board of Ed members, should we individually respond back to the person, let them know we have nothing substantive on our personal device and the district will search our email, or do we do nothing?
I wouldn't recommend that approach. I think that FOIA should be handled centrally, and you do have a process in place. Jody's instrumental in the process. Lisa's instrumental in the process. They have a system. I would defer to them to figure out what exists in terms of records and to figure out what's responsive and what's exempt. They might say to you, you know what, I want you to respond affirmatively X, whether or not you have something, or they might not. But I wouldn't do anything until your central process comes to you and asks you to do it.
So just to go back to don't look like a bump on a log, it would be acceptable to respond to the person saying, we have a centralized system. I have forwarded your email to.
Just automatically.
If it just goes, if it just goes to you individually, that would be appropriate. But if it goes to the full board, which typically these requests do, Jody responds and says, thank you. I'm confirming receipt on behalf of, the board or the administration.
In the past, Tony's the one who's acknowledged receipt.
Right.
Our chair. In point of reference, are we changing that policy or?
He's been sharing it with Lisa and myself, and then we acknowledge and
Okay.
CC Lisa. I acknowledge and CC Lisa on it and keep it specific to that.
I recommend that for everything.
But the individual member does not have to respond.
No,
No.
as long as,
No,
no.
go through our process.
Yeah,
Just
because
forward that
Please
email
don't.
over.
now, anything that you have will need to be collected and reviewed,
Mhm.
but there's no need for individual board members or employees, because sometimes employees can get FOIA requests. It all should go through the central process to ensure that you're searching diligently, that everything is centrally reviewed and collected, and otherwise it becomes too chaotic. There's too much room for error in terms of what you're reviewing and searching and collecting. So I think it's been working very well to have the centralized process, and all of the school districts I work with handle it the same way.
So if we get a request, like I sat on the FOC, which is like this quasi town and school mashup. So I get these emails that they want FOIA. I don't know that they always include Jody. They may only include the members of the FOC. At that point, I'm not I know that my role is not to do the search nor provide results. My question is more along the lines of, do I just simply forward the email to Jody?
Yes.
Okay. And as far as my personal responsibility as a Board of Ed member, if I do not respond to the person who made the FOIA request, I have no obligation or responsibility to respond to them.
Well, let me be clear. You have an obligation, yes, to provide the records that you have, right? But you don't have to personally say, here are my records. Thank you for your email. But if Jody didn't do as good a job as she does, and somehow your records weren't collected and provided, that would come back on you. But in terms of a process,
No, I'm talking about just acknowledging.
no,
The
you don't
request.
have an obligation to do that.
Okay.
Jody can say, I am responding on behalf of the board members to this request.
So my responsibility ends essentially with, if I receive an email because I'm on a committee, so a
Mhm.
FOIA email, and I'm on a committee where the entire Board of Ed is not requested, or Jody's not CC'd, whatever the case may be, my responsibility is as simple as forwarding that email to Jody,
Mhm.
and that's it. I don't have to respond to the sender saying, we've sent, as you are aware, or whatever, we centralize FOIA requests. I have forwarded your request on to the person who handles these things.
You don't have to do that.
Can I? To close the loop. I like to close loops on things.
You can. I want to think about that, and
Okay.
I don't want to kind of talk through it on the fly. I think that's something that's more appropriate to be discussed confidentially as your legal counsel. Okay. But what I will say is that, most importantly, it's important to have a process to make sure that everybody's email or records are collected, reviewed, everything is responded to. And typically the central office administration handles things centrally for the board members and for personnel. But we can talk, again, kind of attorney-client privileged about the best way to do that and different ways to handle it, if you want. I'm happy to talk about that. So let me just look at the time. I just want to cover very quickly conflicts of interest. And I'm skipping around a little bit, but this has to do with individual board members and ways to handle different scenarios. So a board member malcontent, those of you who have been to the Nutmeg Board of Education with my colleague Tom, know malcontent, has been causing issues for the board. During meetings, he would often verbally attack the motives of other members and staff, and it was suspected that he leaked information from an executive session. He would visit school buildings unannounced, demanding to be able to visit classrooms to check on underperforming teachers. But the last straw for the board was when he voted to approve the new teacher's contract, even though his wife was a teacher in the district. In a special meeting where Mal was not in attendance, they voted 6-0 to oust him from the board. Any problems here?
Sounds like malcontent has.
Oh, malcontent. I was just looking at Mal.
Drink some more of that
Well,
coffee.
depends on what you mean by any problems here. So clearly a bunch of his behavior was problematic. The
Like what?
Well, I'm guessing that most of it is probably not, he probably shouldn't show up unannounced and
Let's
get demand.
Marvelous, let us kill
Probably can't vote
somebody
for
out.
the contract if his wife is a member of the staff. I could be wrong about that one. He's obviously not supposed to be brutally attacking people. So like,
Yeah.
it seems like the whole behavior, the question of course is like, are we, the hypothetical we hear, allowed to vote to oust him? I'm guessing the answer is no, but you can censure him.
He must have taken this class before.
Well, I know, right? I'm catching up to speed. It's only now
You're-
2 hours and 20 minutes in, so I'm
No,
finally getting my legs.
you're almost 100% right, but you correctly pointed out that you weren't sure about whether he could vote on the contract. Does anybody have an answer to that?
I would imagine he can.
Yeah, he can. So conflict of interest has a specific meaning. Interestingly, it's not defined in the law, but generally it means that a conflict of interest is where you have a pecuniary interest or a direct personal interest in a matter. There are how many teachers in Weston? A lot, right? And so, in fact, I would argue that Mal has an obligation, has a responsibility to vote on the teacher's contract, because that's one of the biggest line items in your budget. And so to not vote on that, I think would be abdicating his responsibility. But if his wife were involved in some sort of grievance hearing, that would be a different story, because then we're dealing with his wife as an individual, and he should recuse himself. But the teacher's contract is different. you do have a bylaw, 9270, that says the board will not employ or accept application from any teacher or other employee on a permanent basis if such teacher or other employee is a member of the board or is the father, mother, brother, sister, wife, husband, domestic partner of a civil union, son, daughters, etc., of the superintendent or any member of the board. But that's different. That's if somebody is sitting there as a board member and you have a new application. There might be situations where you already have a relative, and you're, who's part of the school district and you're a board member. So, and you're also correct about you can't vote to remove an elected official, but you can censure. And you can also remove a officer from office. So you could remove your chair, vice chair, or secretary from office for certain reasons. Now, board members have due process rights as well. So the board member would have a right to a hearing, such as it is, to respond to whatever criticism you were lodging against them, whether in a censure capacity or in a removal of an officer capacity. I have never experienced the board censuring another board member. I think it's rarely used, even when board members are behaving badly. I think boards tend to find that politically unpalatable. What's more common is what I was saying at the very beginning, bless you,
Bless
is
you.
where you have your self-review. That's an opportunity in executive session to give individual board members feedback about their behavior, their conduct. So just some general concepts about conflict of interest. Board members cannot be employed by the school district, which you probably know, but there's no statutory provision against a relative being employed. As I just mentioned, you do have a bylaw on that issue. And board member actions may be governed by board policies or an ethics provision in a local charter. Lisa said you're all going to get a copy of your bylaws. And as I mentioned, you may need to recuse yourself in certain situations. Let's see. There was also, I thought that there was, I wanted to mention one thing. Okay,
Hey,
yeah,
Peter
I'll
or
get to that.
Bernie or anyone who might be dialing, you may want to put yourselves on mute.
I would just strategize.
Okay, so
Can you see who's muted?
It's Peter and I was trying to
Oh,
move him
unmute?
over, but I think he just did now.
I want to talk quickly about this one, the role of the superintendent. This is kind of a good scenario to work through. We talked a lot about the board's role. You know generally that your superintendent is your chief executive officer responsible for the day-to-day operation of the school district. But how about this one? In October, the superintendent learned that she would need to update the technology in certain classrooms at a cost of $35,000. The superintendent sought board approval for this expenditure, and the board decided it did not need to take action because this was an instructional issue and therefore within the purview of the superintendent. Was the board right?
I don't know, is there
I
a,
think it depends on the dollar amount.
yeah, is there a minimum
Probably.
under which? That was my question too.
There is for gifts.
No, she doesn't need permission from the board.
It's good practice, though.
Yeah.
Don't you
Well, we have a
think?
finance committee. We would bring it there and
Yeah,
have a
That's usually how we
conversation.
do it in practice.
I mean, I would think that no, because we do the budget, right?
As long
So
as it's
it's,
allocated.
right.
Mm.
And even if it's not allocated, it seems to me like the answer is no.
yeah. So I think it depends, right? If it's budgeted for, then you've already dealt with that. If it's not budgeted for, then policy 3150 talks about line item transfers and different ways to deal with unanticipated expenses. And I'm not going to go through the policy, but basically that policy governs whether the board would need to approve those things. Basically what it says in short is the superintendent shall recommend to the board transfers from one line item to another as needed. The superintendent is authorized to make such transfers as necessary if the urgent need for the transfer prevents the board from meeting in a timely fashion to consider the transfer, provided such transfers shall not exceed 5%. So that's the answer to that. But what about if the technology was donated? Would that make a difference?
It wasn't needed?
If it was donated,
Oh,
if it
donated.
was a gift.
Well, I think I don't know what the specifics are, but we probably have a rule on gifts.
Yeah, it's policy 3280. And, you know, interestingly, and you can look at it, I actually printed this
$500.
one.
Yeah,
But there are certain criteria that a gift needs to meet in order to be accepted. And one of the big ones is it can't create an ongoing obligation, financial obligation on the part of the board. It can't have strings, right? Just generally speaking, you don't have that phrase in here, but can't have strings attached. And it says that your policy says that the superintendent shall inform the Board of Education of any gift valued at more than $500 that has been accepted by the district. So there was also, Melissa, I'm just trying to remember, you had mentioned a scenario that was coming up about donations.
Yes.
Okay, do you want to talk about that or?
Yeah, I think what we wanted to have a discussion of, you know, board members' services that they may have, and, you know, the difference between an area of expertise that a board member may have in terms of how, you know, how do they give that advice and help to the district in a constructive way that doesn't create a conflict of interest, right? But, you know, no exchange of money. It's a professional service in an area of expertise. Another would be a scenario where a board member has product or a type of service that may be useful to the district, and how does the district go about analyzing whether it's appropriate to accept that service, either donated or financially?
Yeah. So I think it goes to two policies, the conflict of interest policy and the gift policy. And, you know, generally speaking, whatever, even a donation of a service has to be consistent with their gift policy. And there can't be, I think it's important.
For my first criteria, I don't mean to cut you off, but
Oh, yeah, no.
I think you're going down a slightly different path.
Sure.
This is more like, you know, I'm a lawyer, you know, David works in IT, you know, when is it helpful to say that, you know, you just have professional experience that you can offer? Like, I mean, I chair the policy committee because I'm a lawyer, I review policies and things. It's a natural fit for me. You know, if we're looking at technology issues in the school or security measures in the school, and David has knowledge and expertise about that, how and where is it appropriate to use, you know, to use those skill sets in a way that doesn't create pressure or even the perception of a conflict of interest.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think that what I would say is that, to your point, different board members bring different things to the table. That's why you're elected, right? You come to the table with a certain set of expertise, with a certain background, and it's helpful to have those expertise inform your work. It might guide which committee you're on. It might guide your feedback. But I would say, generally speaking, beyond that, I don't think it would be appropriate to offer a service to the school district, because you could end up putting yourself in a situation where you might be conflicted out of an important decision that you would have to make as a board. You might come into contact with information that you shouldn't really know because of your quasi-judicial role about staff members or about students. And so I think it's really important to remind yourselves that you are in an oversight capacity and you shouldn't be involved in the day-to-day business of the district. I think if you're donating something, that's different than providing a service. I would draw a distinction, because if you're providing a service, you're more likely to have that line blurred.
Right. But if you're donating something, it's something that isn't renewed with any type of monetary obligation on the district. It isn't something that requires upkeep, subscription services, things like
Right,
that.
it meets the criteria. And if you're donating something, I would say as long as it satisfies these criteria and doesn't somehow inadvertently create a conflict of interest because you're getting free advertising, right, for your business.
Okay.
Right,
It doesn't
that could be a problem.
Can you donate knowledge? I know it's kind of, so, you know, to Melissa's example, right? Melissa is an attorney. I'm in the tech field. Obviously, the board uses Melissa's legal expertise on the committees that she sits on, and it's a gift to have, right? That expertise. I have expertise in IT. If I were to sit on a committee, or I was to have a conversation with someone within the district about what, technology, I'm donating my expertise
Mhm.
or my knowledge,
Mhm.
but neither one of us are asking for anything in return, right? Melissa's not asking that her firm become the town attorney, and I'm not asking, nor would I even want the town to buy product from me.
Mhm.
So I think the question is there's knowledge and expertise that we have as individuals, but don't want anything in return.
Yeah, I would put that in the category of you are who you are, and you were elected probably in part for that reason because of what you bring to the table. So I would kind of reframe donating knowledge as you're donating your time, you're donating your expertise as a professional, as a personal, as a person. I think that's all part of being a good board member. I think that where it becomes challenging is, so I'll just use IT as an example. If you said, you know what, I'm gonna watch. I'm sorry, I'm not an IT professional, but I'm going to make all of the schools fiber optic compatible, and I'm going to bring my team in, and I'm going to go, drill in the ground, and I'm going to lay the wires. That's different, right? You sitting there and brainstorming with us before about the best way to collect survey feedback. You're bringing your expertise to the table when you're engaging in that discussion. I do think there's a line between those two things.
And when the firewall or the stopgap be, no one person is making the decision.
Right.
So when you have somebody who has expertise and they bring it to a committee or bring it to individuals, you're not we as board members are not in a role to compel or make a decision singularly.
That's a really good point. When you are engaging in a discussion where your expertise comes to light because you're talking about it, you're right. You're deciding as a board. But I think that highlights the distinction that I'm drawing. That's different from you calling up Lisa and saying, I'm bringing my team in to drill holes in the wall and in the ground.
Well,
Terrible example, I realize. But I do think there's a difference between donating your services and participating in the discussion as yourself.
and when we quantify gift, not only is it a monetary gift, but we're also talking about like tangible gifts, like equipment.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Right?
Of course.
So even though you may have leftover servers, let's just say, right, and you're not using them, maybe you bought them and, for a client and it's leftover and you want to donate them now to the school district. That's also considered a
Yes.
gift,
Mhm.
even though
It is.
there's no exchange of funds
Well, it's like
technically,
this.
right? And so then you would need to include additional people to have a conversation around whether or not the servers would be compatible to our system. And then you or the superintendent and the board and whoever else you deem needs to be around the table would then need to make a decision on whether or not you're going to accept it, correct?
Well, that's exactly the scenario.
Okay.
And that's.
Well, that is I was thinking like,
Oh,
oh,
no,
you
the
put
technology was donated.
Oh,
donated.
okay. I thought you were talking about like $35,000 worth of equipment to purchase technology with.
No, I had
I'm sorry.
your exact scenario in
Okay.
mind, which is if the actual technology was donated, not
Okay.
all technology is created equal. Maybe we don't want
Right.
those servers. Maybe it would slow everything
Correct.
down, to your
Correct.
point.
Or there was a slippery slope once, many years ago where somebody donated a piano. I wasn't superintendent at the time. And, it was a beautiful piano, wanted the piano donated, and then wanted the piano appraised and a letter specifying the gift, I think, for the
For tax.
person's taxes.
Yeah.
And that the piano was worth over $50,000. And then it was, move the piano and we pay for the so some of these are slippery slopes.
Yeah.
The other thing I think is slippery is someone, I've had people say to me, I've written a book, superintendent, and I really like your feedback on the book, and I'm going to give you a copy of the book. And I'm very cautious of that because they're looking for an endorsement,
Hmm.
you know, from the district about a book that they've written on a subject. And I think that, you know, gifting us a book with the idea of, oh, let's talk about what you thought of my book. I don't know. Sometimes this can be a lot more complicated than just the
Well,
way
that's
it
what I was,
looks.
in some of these, you know, in our conversation about this, I think, you know, when you're offering services or a gift, tangible or intangible, and it requires the staff to be taught a certain methodology, you know, then you start coming into,
Yeah.
costs, time costs, experience costs, that sort of thing, curriculum review. you know,
Exactly.
I don't know. So that was kind of the
Or-
conversation. I was having
Or
about.
you also, I think, have to look at equity and access issues, you know, like I want to donate this to this particular use in a classroom. That's great. But what about the other classrooms?
Sure.
You know, and that's where I think some of this stuff really gets very tricky and people unintendedly, people mean well, but it causes issues and concerns.
Yeah, if I could just add to that question from a previous district that we had with, I know we don't have multiple elementary schools, but we ran into a problem with like
Haves and
PTOs
have-nots. Oh,
donating
yeah.
a large sums of money specifically for like their playgrounds. And then it created this really large
It's an
equity
equity
issue,
issue, yeah.
depending on the amount of different PTOs that could actually raise that money. And then now we've got a
Mhm.
equity issue around the playground equipment for all kids in the district to use and the difference between the different equipment. And so we ended up, you know, having to really think about that slippery slope when you're accepting donations that potentially could create an inequity
Well, that's
with gifts.
yeah, I mean, this is outside the scope, but that's that's a really interesting separate topic of
Yeah.
conversation around booster clubs
Yes,
and
yes,
PTOs
yes.
and their
Oh,
role and how
yes,
do you
yes.
process
Title
donations
IX,
and
all
Title
of that.
IX. And,
Right.
but everything that you all said is really important. It's all on the yellow sheet and
Mhm.
everything is in here.
Yeah.
The gift will not imply endorsement of any business or
Yeah.
product, has a purpose consistent with the purposes of the school district. Will not begin a program that the Board of Education would be unwilling to take over when the gift or grant funds are exhausted. Will place no restrictions on the school program. So there's a lot, not all gifts are going to necessarily help, right? A lot of them actually are not going to meet these criteria and shouldn't be accepted. And Title IX is a big issue for sure. The equity and access piece is important, but there are other considerations to take into account.
Just to get a tidy answer on this, because one of the reasons we're, I think, talking about this is I had before being seated, I run a training company and I had offered to donate some public speaking curriculum specifically for the high school, to the high school. This is before I ever got seated. So, I mean, that offer's still out there, but it seems like given what we're talking about, it's like way too messy. That would satisfy like 7 of the 9 of these, but maybe 9 are fudgy. So is it better just to like sort of Hippocratic oath style, just like not do any of that? Like, meaning like we should just avoid that?
I don't want to say avoid in general. I would
Mhm.
just say that it's pretty, it's easy not to meet all of these criteria.
Yeah,
is what I would say.
Okay.
And then the other thing I would say is that, you know, we always look when we're working with public agencies, we always look at treating similarly situated individuals or situations similarly. So the
Yeah.
thing that I often think about as a lawyer is if we say yes over here, what precedent does that create?
Yes.
Mhm.
Right? And so what you're donating might be great. It might meet most of these, but then we have to be really careful because
Yep.
then how do we tell this person,
Yeah.
oh, yours meets most of these as well, but we're going to say no. So that's why policy, procedure, sticking to the rules is so important because you want to avoid creating precedents that you can't follow in all situations.
Okay.
Can I ask one other clarifying question? Did I hear you say about the budget on this example that here we don't require approval of transfer of funds over a certain amount, or we do? Like you can just approve that line.
There's
item
certain
transfer.
emergency situation. I have to, it's your policy on that is.
You're talking about that, for example, like,
Yeah.
okay, we're gonna take this
31,
money.
right. Like if you didn't allocate those funds last year and now you're in a predicament where you need the 35,000 and, you know, we decided to not go with this, I don't know, company or something that we could alleviate those funds to transfer to get those classrooms up to code, so to speak. From past experience, it was always over $10,000. You needed board approval to make any line transfers.
Yeah.
That's not the case here.
So this says that the superintendent is authorized to make urgent transfers as necessary,
Okay.
but those transfers shall not exceed 5% on a cumulative basis. But I think I would look at, I only copied a piece of this. It's 3150.
Okay.
It
Yeah, I have
spells
it
out
here.
everything.
Okay, thank you.
It's 3150.
That's
Um,
why though it is so important to, I mean, we would never just do that.
No.
We would take it to finance.
Right.
You know, I remember at one of the last Board of Finance meetings, they said, this is town level. When you have $56 million, you can pay for this, like find the money, which I guess, yeah, they're right, but you have to kind of go through certain lenses.
Right, that's why the
of
questions
how
up there.
Exactly,
made me a
to
little
do it.
nervous.
And I think the finance committee, the subcommittee is so important, you know?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm just gonna, since we only have 15 minutes left, I'm gonna skip ahead to FOIA.
Where does 3 hours go?
I know.
At just for 9 o'clock, you're like,
Yeah.
wow, 3 hours.
You know, this always
FOIA.
happens actually.
We're having fun, that's right.
And I can never predict where most of the discussion will happen, but we did talk a lot about FOIA along the way.
Well,
You
we
all
did
know
once.
that FOIA is really the state law that governs how you operate as a board. It covers how you hold meetings and the requirements around holding meetings, which is how you function as a board, whether it be as a board as a whole or in committees. And it also deals with public records, which we talked about. So, let me just skip to the good thing. So interestingly, a meeting has a specific definition under FOIA, and it's not everything. It's any hearing or other proceeding of a public agency, which you are, any convening or assembly of a quorum of a multi-member public agency, which you are, and any communication by or to a quorum of a multi-member public agency. That's where we see the problem with email coming in, whether in person or by means of electronic equipment, to discuss or act upon a matter over which the public agency has supervision, control, jurisdiction, or advisory. So that's where all of this comes from. It's that law. It's section 1-200 of the Freedom of Information Act that defines meeting. But there are certain things that are not meetings. And so what's not a meeting? A meeting of a personnel search committee for an executive level candidate search. So the key there is if you're searching for the superintendent, which of course you never will be because Lisa's going to stay with you forever. Or if you are searching for a principal or an assistant principal. So if you have meetings to talk about that search, it's actually not a meeting of the board, provided you create a committee to conduct that search. That's the one procedural thing you have to remember. The board can appoint itself as a committee of a whole, or you can appoint a subcommittee, but you have to have a personnel search committee. Any chance meeting or social meeting, what do I mean by that? If you all happen to be at the same restaurant, that's not technically a meeting, or if you have a party. But what I would say is that I would caution against that, planning social meetings as a board, because even if you don't discuss anything related to board business, the appearance of it, I think, will invite questions, and it's just probably not a road you want to go down. I think you all know that strategy and negotiations with respect to collective bargaining, those meetings are not meetings. So anytime we meet, for example, if I presented to you all about the teacher's contract, that would not be a meeting. It would be a non-meeting with respect to collective bargaining. A caucus of members of a single political party, that's never a meeting. 3 of you who are Republicans could meet and it would be a caucus. And communications that are limited to notice of meetings of a public agency or their agendas. That's just, we're meeting at this time. That's actually not considered to be a meeting, even if you talk about it over email. So an administrative or staff meeting of a single member public agency. This is something that not many people know. Lisa is a single member public agency as the superintendent. So she is herself subject to FOIA. Now, as a practical matter, that never really comes into play, except if Lisa creates a committee that is not just a meeting of her staff or a meeting of cabinet, but it's a special committee to review a special thing. That committee in and of itself would become a public agency subject to FOIA and would have to be noticed accordingly. So this was actually the subject of a FOIA complaint a number of years ago. It was a kindergarten review committee, and it consisted of parents and a board member and members of the superintendent's staff. The committee was created by the superintendent, and the Freedom of Information Commission ruled that when that committee met, it needed to comply with FOIA. A quorum of members of your board that are present at any event which has been noticed and conducted as a meeting of another public agency is not a meeting. So if you all attend, a meeting of a town committee and there's a quorum of you present, the fact that you're there doesn't make that a meeting of your board that is subject to FOIA. So there's regular, special, and emergency meetings. I think that you all know about this, so I'm just going to go over this quickly. Let me just see where I want to go here. This is an interesting one. The policy committee has been updating certain policies and deleting others. The policy on public complaints has received a lot of public attention because some members of the public are concerned that the board may eliminate the policy and thus deprive them of their forum for complaining to the board. Given the public attention, some board members who are not on the policy committee want to attend the meeting of the policy committee at which the public complaint policy will be discussed. So the question is it a problem if a quorum of the full board attends a policy committee meeting?
I think it is if they attend as board members. If they attend as a member of the public, it's fine.
Yeah. And so how do you make sure that they're attending as members of the public and not as members, board
They don't
members?
participate.
Yeah, we
can't talk,
identified
right?
them, and this is when we were doing it in person, they sat on the other side of the room, they didn't contribute.
Yeah, I think exactly. So it's the optics are important. So if the policy committee were meeting today and we're sitting around this table, then the other board members who came would have to sit over here where the members of the public sit, and they shouldn't participate. They probably shouldn't even provide public comment, although you don't have public comment at your committee meetings anyway. They can observe. So is the full board bound by the recommendation of the policy committee?
No.
Regarding policy? No. So this is another tricky one. The board was in a special budget meeting a special meeting to discuss the budget when it learned of dire economic news that meant significant staffing cuts were necessary. Knowing that the board would need to discuss and decide the elimination of specific positions and not wishing to needlessly distress or excite its employees, the chair added an executive session item to the agenda to discuss personnel matters. With a 5-2 vote, the board entered executive session. After an hour of discussion, the board of members agreed without a vote to direct the superintendent to cut 10 staff positions. What are the issues here?
Probably without, go ahead, Wilson.
No, please go ahead.
So I'm guessing that without a vote is part of the last sentence there. That's an issue. One of the things.
Yeah, yes.
You
So
can't just tag it on.
Yeah, I don't think in executive session
You can't just tag it on at a special budget meeting. Okay, now we're gonna do this,
right.
right? I mean,
So first of all, you're right. You can't add an agenda item to a special meeting. So that's problem one. Problem two is that you can't go into executive session to discuss personnel matters generally. Executive sessions are appropriate to discuss specific people and their appointment, their review, etc. But this is really a budget issue masquerading as a personnel issue.
Right.
Number three, you can't call an executive, you can't describe the reason for going into an executive session that generally. You have to describe it more specifically. And boards are often really surprised to hear that they have to name the person they're discussing, right? So if you can't name the person, you're probably not appropriately in executive session. So that's the problem. And also finally, to your point, how do you direct the superintendent to do something without voting? That's in effect a vote, and you can't vote in executive session. You can never vote in executive session. You can discuss, But then if something requires board action, you have to exit executive session and take the vote, the discussion having occurred in executive session.
There was something else you said that it caused me pause that I think, we have to remember is when we have these committee meetings, these subcommittee meetings of policy or a curriculum or communication, people that want to listen into the meeting, there's no public comment, correct?
Well, right. So according to your bylaws, that's right. Now, there's no rule in FOIA. Actually, FOIA is silent as to public comment in general.
We've had public comment at policy. meetings.
That's why I'm wondering.
We definitely have. I mean, if a member of the public joins a policy meeting on a Tuesday morning to listen to a policy put with them and they want to say something,
I think we should clarify that because I do remember on a couple of occasions, both in curriculum and definitely in communication. I don't know why, because communication is probably not that exciting, but we have had people who wanted to do public comment on June runs those meetings, right? Yeah.
That's why I was bringing it up. I
And-
couldn't
yeah.
remember.
What we did was, I remember once for sure in communication, we allowed it and I kind of said, we'll ask for forgiveness later, not knowing if we're breaking any rules.
I don't think there's a rule as to public comment in committee meetings. I think my practice has been just to treat it like the regular board meeting. You can make your public comment and that's what it is. It's a public comment.
Yeah, here's what I would say about that. For your board bylaws, I know about public comment because you modified them during COVID. But that was only at regular meetings. It doesn't talk about committee. I'm doing this from memory, but I'm virtually certain it only talks about public comment at regular meetings, not even
Yeah.
special meetings necessarily. So it really is up to you how you want to handle public comment outside of that. But what I would say is it's important to be consistent.
Yeah.
And not because of FOIA or anything else, but it's really important for free speech reasons and for, to viewpoint discrimination reasons. And you can vary by meeting, but I would say at the outset, we're having public comment or we're not, right? I think the problem would come if you let one person speak and not another. But I would suggest that you all think about that maybe in the policy committee, how you want to handle public comment outside of the regular meeting context, which again, I think is covered in your bylaws.
And if we do offer public comment, does that have to be an agenda item?
Well, so public comment can be handled any which way. Some boards, I think you guys do, you invite public comment at the beginning as an agenda item. Some boards allow public comment after every agenda item.
Yeah.
And I think that the boards that I know that allow public comment at committee meetings do not have it as a standalone agenda item at the beginning of the committee meeting, but they do have it after some of the agenda items. It's really up to you. I would just say be consistent and have a rule that you can follow, even if the rule is subject to variation depending on the circumstance.
And that consistency is required of all the subcommittees, you're saying as well.
It's not required,
But it's good
but
practice.
think
Yeah.
about, I think what's a good practice is to have some sort of consistent practice that you follow that covers all your committees. Maybe it's not consistent because maybe the EOC, right, should be treated differently for one reason or another than the policy committee or the curriculum committee. But I think it's something that's important to think about deliberately if it's an issue and come up
Sure.
with some sort of procedure.
Yeah, I think do that.
We're almost out of time, so I'll just ask you all, where do you want to go next? I have some slides on Robert's rules, and you, of course, can use this as a resource if we don't cover
The
it.
only area we touched on it a little bit, but I want to make sure we kind of make sure nobody has any outstanding question about the role of committees in terms of reporting back to the full board. I know we had some questions come up with the negotiations and the collective bargaining and what the role is of the negotiations committee versus the full board. I think it would be important to kind of go over that.
Yeah, sure. Well, that's a kind of a unique one. So,
I think that's why it came up.
yeah. So the negotiations committee is like any other committee in that you have a subset of your board that sits on the negotiations team and is authorized to make decisions in the context of the negotiation process. But the ultimate decision about what you've agreed to, and it has budget implications, is subject to approval by the full board. So that always would come back to the full board. So at the end of the night, during mediation, the board and the teachers union, for example, reaches a tentative agreement. It's called a tentative agreement. It's basically a term sheet that's signed by both parties, you know, if all goes well and it doesn't go to arbitration. But it always says at the top, subject to ratification by both the teachers union and the board.
Right.
So the committee, much like any other committee, like your policy committee, the committee can work on an issue, peer negotiations, but it always comes to the full board for approval. Can the board reject the contract or reject the agreement? It can, but that's just, it's not a good practice. It's not a good look. And you choose your committee, your committee members because you believe that they will be, you know, capable of making decisions throughout the negotiation process that will be appropriate. The other thing that I think is unique about negotiations is that it is a wacky process. It is a very wacky process. And at the end of the day, you don't have much control over the outcome. It's governed. I always start out by explaining that to board members who are new to the process, even to Board of Finance people who are new to the process. It is a very circumscribed, you know, process that is governed by a law, the Teacher Negotiation Act. It's governed ultimately by what you would expect an arbitrator to award, and the arbitrators award what everybody else is getting at the end of the day. There's variation, of course, depending on the relative wealth of the community. But the priority considerations are the financial capability of the town and the public interest. And so that's why I say negotiations is a unique one, because there isn't a whole lot of wiggle room for your committee members to make decisions.
And if the members of the board that are not members of the negotiations committee feel that there's, you know, issues that are important to them during the year, or economic issues or concerns that they have that they want to be represented during the negotiation process, you know, and anyone, you know, feel free to chime in. But you know, is it fair to say that that those concerned are represented by delegation first and foremost, right? That members of the negotiations committee are addressing those as members of the board, and second, that, you know, through the process of the budget, through the process of, you know, all of our committee work all year, we're hearing the issues that are important, and as negotiations committee members, and incorporating that as part of the negotiations process when we meet with the council ahead of time to develop, you know, what concerns we have from the administration's perspective in terms of language, finance, what we want to have brought up. Well, how else can members, because the complaints I was hearing this time around was that people felt like they weren't a part of the process. But as you said, the process is so narrow, and there isn't the opportunity that day to get the feedback. How do
Let me ask in a different way. Your description of the process is spot on.
you
Pretty much know where it's going to end up, and it's too bad we can't jump 10 hours, not wasting 10 hours. But would it be appropriate in, since we've just completed 2 of the 3, would it be appropriate in an executive session for you to come to the board and say, here's what's going on in the state, you know, kind of across the board in an executive session, so the board, ahead of when we're going into negotiations, have an idea of what the lay of the land is as we're moving into a labor negotiation?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
maybe that's
Yeah.
a step forward.
Yeah,
Sure.
and the other thing that you could do, and it doesn't really, I'm not necessarily recommending this, but sometimes in unique situations, I've had boards do this. If there's an issue like insurance, for instance, because you switched from the state partnership plan to the high deductible plan that hasn't been raised with the full board before, or there's something, you know, very unique that the committee wants to do, it would be fine to meet as a full board. It's a non-meeting to talk about collective bargaining, to update the board and get their feedback on that particular issue.
As a non-meeting.
Yeah, it's a non-meeting because you're in the middle of collective bargaining. The fact that you have a subcommittee does not preclude you from meeting as a full board to get feedback from your other board
But is that
members.
public then for the, you know, for the adverse parties in the collective bargaining to hear? Is that?
No,
it's
it's
the
a
non-meeting
non-meeting,
is not
private.
recorded. Okay.
It's
Just
not
like-
public.
So I'm the one, obviously, that became a little focus of attention over negotiations at the end because I abstained. And I abstained based on, I had no prior knowledge and I wasn't sure that the teachers got everything they could have, or the town got what, so I had no idea. So I said to Melissa, the intent was, is there not a process? And I think based on what Steve said and what you're saying, there could be a process where I understand that a couple of things now that were different than before. Number one, there's a delegation of certain members of the Board of Ed, and it basically starts and finishes roughly in the same night. But is there, it sounds like there is an opportunity, and maybe we didn't do it procedurally being amongst ourselves, we didn't talk about it, whatever the case may be. But we could, as a board of 7, prior to going into negotiations where you go in and you don't come out until you have something agreed upon, there is an opportunity prior to that where the 7 board members could get together and have a conversation. What would have been helpful for me would to know going prior to the delegation going in, what's the trend? What are other towns providing? What does it look like the teachers in Weston are going to be asking for? And what are the areas? Essentially have a conversation so that rather than finding out after everything is done, this is the best we could do, have a conversation going in saying, let's just say the delegation in the future is Melissa, Steve, and Chad. The 3 of them say, look, we met with the 7 board members. We heard from you the things that you'd like for us to be able to offer. Benefits are really important. You want to make sure the teachers have really good benefits. That's something, benefits. So is there the opportunity, I think you said yes, that the board could meet and have a conversation so that the 7 members could be heard, and our what we want to make sure we're represented during negotiations is heard before the negotiations occur, where there is no opportunity to say, well, they got 3%. I think they should have gotten 3.5%, or they had, health benefit paid in full. I think that they should have contributed 10%.
So let me just start by saying it's actually not one night. It's a long process. And it's multiple negotiation sessions. It's which culminates in a all-night mediation typically, which may or may not result in a settlement. And if it doesn't, then usually it results in a settlement before arbitration, or then it goes to arbitration. So it's a process that can happen over 3 or 4 months. To answer your question though, yeah, for sure. I could come, for example, and it would probably be an executive session if it's happening before collective bargaining begins. And I give you legal advice about trends and other things. The only thing I would say though, is that because of the way the process works, there are things that happen during that time period, those 3 months during negotiations, that we can't predict. And that's why you have this group of 3 that need to be nimble. They need to have flexibility to make decisions during the negotiation process, depending on what the teachers put on the table. I'm just using the teachers as an example, what the board wants, what the different priorities are, what the trade-offs are. So 100%, we can kind of predict, we can tell you general trends, but it's still important for that committee to have flexibility to make decisions on the fly, understanding that ultimately the agreement, the tentative agreement, will come back to the board for full approval and ratification.
So there can be a non-meeting meeting. So it sounds like, what would have made me much more comfortable with the outcome is, number one, potentially having that pre-meeting before negotiations occur, an executive session where, we get, or I got sort of, this is what is trending among what your teachers are asking for in other districts.
Just so you know, there is not going to be a trend at the outcome of negotiation, because you guys have an early budget submission date. You're one of the first to go.
Okay.
And so if you were a different district with a later budget submission date and a later negotiation cycle, I'd be able to share trends.
Okay.
But we start in July. I might have 4 districts on my list of where the settlements are. To your point, though, there are certain things, like I could tell you what the CPI is, the Consumer Price Index. I can tell you how the Teacher Negotiation Act works. I can tell you your administration can share some of the operational concerns that have been raised, because there are 2 major components to any collective bargaining process. One is operational issues, language issues, we call them, like, how much wraparound time? How long do you want your teachers to stay before school and after school? That's a classic language issue. And then, of course, there's the economics, there's salary and insurance. So I can tell you insurance, like substantive insurance trends, like for example, people are leaving the state plan, not going into it, right? Or, you know, your claims history is X. So sure, I'm only saying this because there is a limit to what we can share at the outset. So I wouldn't want you at the end of that process to say, you didn't tell me that, right? And I also think there's a limit to how many times the committee can really come back to the full board, just as a practical matter.
Right, so, right, and that, absolutely, so, it sounds like it would be possible if that pre-meeting was beneficial, if you don't have a lot of, you know, for the fourth district to typically go, then it might be more beneficial for the board to have an executive just amongst the board members and not, you know, not have to type your time. But we could potentially have a non-meeting meeting at some point during that 3-month cycle to take so we can find out from the 3 Board of Ed members what's going on, how are things looking, and are there things that other board members feel strongly about that we can, you know, we can't promise you we're going to be able to do this, but we can hear you out.
I think that's right. Just be mindful of what comes at the very beginning of the outset is, you know, big stacks of things that each side wants and desires. And then really it gets culled down in kind of the all day mediation. So most of the narrowing of the issues is occurring in that
Right.
10-hour meeting.
To your point, the answer to your question is yes, we can do that or should do that because it is a multi-month process and the board should know that teachers want X, you know, but, you know, let's talk about that. But I can tell you at the end of the day, Jessica and the mediator pretty much know where it's going to come out, you know, give or take a little bit.
Right, and that, I think that for, again, you know, there's a difference between potentially what I did, which is I publicly
you
spoke
came
out
in
versus somebody who may have said, you know what, I don't want to, you know, whatever. It doesn't mean we didn't both feel the same way. It's just that I'm the person that put myself out there. So I think it would be very helpful. And, you know, we can take the temperature among other board members. If a month before, you know, you're going to wind up in this room, we just knew the direction it's going in so that we'd be able to say, yes, we had 3 people representing the Board of Ed. They were absolutely on par with what we spoke about it. It was shared and they did the best they could. And I support the best that they could do. And therefore I, you know, approve to ratify as well. I think that's what I'm asking for. And I think that, maybe that meeting a month before you wind up behind the closed doors is the meeting that would help the 7 members have, you know, be able to say, yes, they did the best.
No, I think I just I wanted you to understand the give and take and all of that happens after. It's just the way the process works. So in terms of how much value you get out of the detail, I think it's more of a big
Yeah, but you should know.
conversation.
But you should know. I mean, the biggest over and above compensation, the biggest decision was moving from out of the state plan to the private plan, and there's economic ramifications both for the town and for the employees of the Board of Education.
Right.
But you know where that is.
Right.
But
And
that was
right,
discussed during the budget process too. I mean, that wasn't a new.
Right, but you had the foresight, and then also Jessica, who said she can foreshadow pretty much what the outcome is going to be, right? Because you do this on a regular basis, so you can share that with the other board members as well. That we can ask for anything we want. Jessica has told us this is probably what we're going to wind up with. So what we have to do is figure out how do we meet in the middle, because the last thing we want is to wind up in really at the end of the day, we don't want arbitration, right? That's really the bottom line.
I think also psychologically, I think what you're saying is it's important for the board, the full board, to feel invested in the process, to feel informed. I will just say, typically what happens is I present in a non-meeting before the board takes its public vote that very night, like I did with you guys. That's usually what happens, but there is absolutely nothing wrong with having a meeting partway through to give you an update. The only thing that, we're all saying is that can shift a lot, and even the settlements can shift, right? So, we might go into that meeting halfway through with the statewide average at 10.68, and all of a sudden we're in mediation and the statewide average is 11.6. And so I just wouldn't want, and I would say that, right? I would tell you guys, oh, just be mindful that these settlements are changing every day.
Right, and that's the point, is that if we had that meeting prior to the half hour before the meeting that we had where we voted on it, that meeting that may have had the month prior, you would have said, look, this is what I'm hopeful for. And then that meeting we had just before, you could say everything fell apart. And the reason things fell apart was X, Y, and Z. And then we have the faith of the people who are on the board that did negotiation. We have the faith of you. And we would, in that scenario, be comfortable with, yeah, you know what? We had a plan going in. This is where we had to meet in the middle. This is where we had to change things up. And it is what it is. It's dynamic, but we did have that discussion prior to.
Yeah, legally, I see nothing wrong with that. That's perfectly
Well, we
fine.
have one more coming up, so we
Yeah,
can
yeah.
certainly do that.
Yeah, we do.
Practice
We
makes
should start soon.
Yeah, we emailed.
Yeah.
Jessica, I'm sorry, I have to go
Yeah.
because my wife needs the car for the drop off.
Sure.
Is it okay if I leave now at this point?
Yeah, I think,
I think we're done.
I think we're done. I
Sure?
didn't cover everything, but you
Yeah.
have my
Your packet.
slide.
Well, I'm the newest
Thank
board
you.
member, so if there are things content-wise we've not gotten to, you
Yeah.
think we should? I mean,
Just
Um,
read
just-
through the,
telepathically reach out to me.
Yeah.
No, I'm
Yeah,
joking,
I mean,
totally
I think
joking. Yeah,
what
I
would
will. I've got all this
say
stuff here.
is the only other thing that we didn't talk about was
Mhm.
the communications protocol. The best way to find out, to get information from Lisa, from Tina, right? And I would just, very quick summary is, first of all, if it's not broken, then there's nothing to fix. But typically, Lisa sends out an agenda packet. She gives you information that you need. If you need specific information or want specific information, just be mindful about the amount of time that will take the administration to put it together. But if it's if you ask, CC the full board
Exactly.
so that the entire board has the same information. It's not really ever a good idea for one board member to have more or different information than all other board members. Even if you have a specific question, everybody else should get the answer too, because you're a deliberative body and you should all be making decisions with the same information. That was the last point I was going to make.
that's a good one.
Thank you, Jessica.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks,
This was
everyone.
really helpful.
Can you stay a few more minutes
Yeah.
to talk about these?
Yeah.
I'll go, Terry.
But, Jeff,
Bye, good to see you.
Nice to meet you.
Thank
you very much.
Much better.
Yeah. Jessica,